name is Jim Ludis. I am the Vice President for Public Research and Executive Director here at, where are we? The Pell Center for Southern Virginia University. If it's Wednesday, it's Newport. I know where I am. It's really a pleasure to welcome all of you here today for an event that I think is obviously of critical importance, particularly if you're working in the defense industry. And others as well. There are a lot of people that we want to thank, so let me very briefly run through this. We want to thank Nectar Labs, which is a division of McLaughlin Research, for their support, as well as the Southeastern New England Defense Industry Alliance. I see Molly in the back. Thank you very much for partnering with us to offer this important workshop today. We want to thank our keynote speaker, Ronald Ross, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. He is really the person to have speak on this issue, and we're thrilled to have him here. We want to thank the other panelists. I know that their time is precious, and we are confident that they have good input and good insights to share with the community today. And I also want to urge everybody to make sure that you visit pellcenter.org to find out the latest of the spring programming, which we're already talking about spring 2018, which is crazy to me. But the spring programming for REACHI and the other things that we've got going on here at the Pell Center, I think that you will find something of interest. I hope you will, anyways. Our keynote speaker today is Ron Ross. He's a fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. His focus areas include information security, system security, engineering, and risk management. Dr. Ross leads the Federal Information Security Modernization Act implementation project, which includes the development of security standards and guidelines for the federal government, contractors, and U.S. critical infrastructure. You can read his whole bio in the program, but needless to say, he's the man. So without further ado, Ron Ross.
Thank you very much. This is a great part of the country. I'd forgotten I'd been here not too long ago. I was coming through the airport last night, and as you know, at the airport, there's a long walk to the parking garage. And I was telling Lisa, we were having coffee this morning in the back area there. I love Dunkin' Donuts, and the nice part about coming to New England is there are Dunkin' Donuts every 20 feet. And you don't get that a lot sometimes when you travel the country. Before I start on 800-171, I want to thank all of you for coming here today. I've been doing cybersecurity for over 30 years now, and I think the thing that's different today than when I started a long time ago, I go back so far, I just went on Social Security last year. I should be retired, but there's too much work to do yet. And I think what's changed, I go back to the days when we had mainframe computers and decks of cards. You had to stand at a card reader. And I know a lot of the younger folks here can't even conceive of that, but that's where we started 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Today, information technology is woven into everything that we do. It's part of the critical infrastructure. It's part of everything that runs your home, from your dishwasher to your refrigerator. I was telling my son the other day, you know, it won't be too long where you're going to buy a new car, and that car is going to be sitting in your garage, if you have a garage, and it's going to wake itself up and it's going to contact the dealer on its own. The dealer is going to run remote diagnostics on the car. The car is going to open the garage door. It's going to drive itself to the dealer. It's going to get serviced. It's going to drive itself back home, put itself back in the garage, close the garage door, and send you the bill in an email. That's where we're headed. Autonomous vehicles are just one thing in this vast Internet of Things that we're building. Our technology is awesome today. And there's a double-edged sword. As much as we love the technology, I argue that the reason we're in the shape we are today with cybersecurity is that we love the technology and we embrace it. We're the best in the world at producing it. But sometimes that gives us a blind spot. We don't really understand the nuts and bolts of computers. The average person doesn't understand what's going on. I call it above the waterline and below the waterline. Above the waterline are things that you see every day with your tablets and your smartphones and all the technology. Everything's working fine above the waterline. Below the waterline is where we talk about systems, hardware, software, firmware, all the things that make that capability so awesome for you. That's where our problems lie today, because we are building an incredibly complicated infrastructure of information technology, which we are totally dependent on. And the word totally is there for a reason. We can't survive without the technology. We were talking this morning about, the EMP attacks, and they do a lot of these scenarios now about an EMP attack, or just losing power in a storm like Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Katrina. You lose power for a day, people get cranky. If you lose it for a week, things start shutting down. You can't move goods and services. So we have built ourselves a wonderful society, highly dependent on very functional technology, and then we have the bad guys. If we didn't have bad guys, none of this stuff would give us any concern. But we do, we always will have bad guys, and they typically will do one of two things to you. Either you as an individual or an organization. First of all, with the vast number of cyber attacks today being fueled by adversaries all around the world with very powerful tools. It used to be if you were a hacker, you had to be pretty specialized. But today you can go out to the dark web, and if you have enough money, you can buy the most sophisticated attacks that you can ever conceive of. And so we've empowered the world. The NSA lost all their tools recently that got exposed. And the adversaries are always pressing on us every day. 2015, we had the bad attack on OPM. Some of you might have been involved in that as far as a victim. I was. You have a top secret clearance. All that information now is safely in the hands of the Chinese because they emptied out the entire database of the most sensitive information the federal government keeps outside of classified data. It's all the security clearance background investigation information on every individual, 22.5 million records. There was also an attack on one of our defense contractors, the design documentation for the F-35 fighter. Again, adversary broke in and they stole it. And it's no coincidence that the new generation of these aircraft that we're seeing in the adversary's arsenal look a lot like the F-35. This is where we are today. You can either get hacked and lose your capability, like if the air traffic control system gets hacked and the FAA loses the air traffic control capability, pilots are flying blind. That's a capability loss. A power plant gets hacked and they lose the ability, the grid shuts down. These are the things that we're concerned about today with critical infrastructure. The other side of that coin is exfiltration. The adversary also has a tendency to want to steal stuff from us. That was the OPM example, the F-35 example. Many times, these attacks are so sophisticated that malicious code will be implanted in your system and you won't even know it's there. We didn't discover the OPM malicious code until 7 months after it was there. Now, 7 months is a lifetime in this business. You can empty out 22 million records in a couple hours, maybe less. So this exfiltration is having a long-term debilitating effect on this country. So cybersecurity is the most important thing we can do today, because when you start to lose your economic edge, we have a lot of research and development in this country. We do a lot of cutting-edge research. Our companies invest heavily in R&D, and that's how you maintain your cutting edge as an economic superpower. If you're leaving your systems open to attack and you're letting your competition or your adversary steal your intellectual property, you may not notice that today, but you will notice it over time as your cutting edge capability starts to degrade. I call that the slow bleed. It's a cut by 1,000, deaths by 1,000 cuts. So this is what I'm giving you all this kind of preparation for this talk today, because a lot of times when you talk about requirements and cybersecurity compliance, people's eyes start to glaze over. And the one thing that surprised me about 801.71, when we published that 2 years ago, I never ever knew there were that many lawyers in the United States of America. It brought out a legion of lawyers because, and it wasn't surprising after all, because when a company is faced with, I call it weaponizing the NIST standards and guidelines. NIST standards and guidelines are usually, if it's guidance documents like in the 800 series, those are pretty much optional. They're not mandatory like a standard might be, where the federal government imposes that standard on the federal agencies. But when a NIST guidance document goes into the FAR clause, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or when it goes into the DFARS, I call that weaponizing the NIST guidance. It now is looked at totally differently than if it were guidance. So when it went into the DFAR, that really changed the whole discussion. And the reason the lawyers were concerned is because if you're going to be held to, even if it's a compliance exercise that involves a self-assessment, here's the requirements in the DFAR, you're a company, you do a self-assessment, you say, I met the requirements. If you make a claim and then there's a cyber attack and you get hacked, the concern of the lawyers is who's liable now? You made a claim and now what's happening with that claim? Because now are you going to have to stand up and say, hey, I got hacked and I didn't do as good a job as I thought. That was the concern. But let me tell you, every system today is vulnerable in some way. We don't build perfect security. So this whole notion about being perfect in the compliance world with 171 is something you should take off your radar right now. It's all about risk management. And risk management is going to mean that you're going to be making decisions, and this is going to be different for every company. The requirements are there. They're in black and white. There's 110 requirements. We'll talk about those later. But how you meet the requirements and how you demonstrate through evidence that you have met those requirements is going to be different for every one of the contracts that you're involved in. I think the DoD at this point is pretty much saying self-assessments are the way they want to go. Now, all CUI is not the same. We're going to talk about that today. What is CUI? And I'm going to assume that you don't know a whole lot about controlled unclassified information, but we will start to kind of roll this picture out for you. This is where it all started with an executive order back in 2010. To give you a sense of what was going on back in that time, the federal government has a huge number of different types of information we deal with. And we also had pretty much anarchy in how we would define the levels of protection for each of those different data types. We had to get our arms around this vast amount of information and the different types we had. And that was where the National Archives and Records Administration, they were called out in the executive order as the executive agent for doing a two-part project. First of all, they were to work with all the federal agencies to define a more concise set of data types that the federal government was going to rally around. And they did that. I'm going to give you a website where you can go to. It's the NARA Controlled Unclassified Information Registry. That's an important place to visit because it has all of the different types of things that are controlled unclassified information. And that's important now. We had a much more reduced set of data types that we had to deal with. The other side of that coin is NARA was required to define the safeguarding and dissemination requirements for all of those different data types that are now CUI. So there are two different parts of the problem, and that's what they did, and this is what launched that entire part of the project. This is what the order actually asked NARA to do. Now, these slides will be available. I'm not going to go into depth on every one of them, but I have a contact slide at the very end. It's got my email address and it's got my cell phone on there. My cell phone is on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I say that with all sincerity. If you have a question that you don't want to raise today, we'll have maybe 5 minutes at the end for questions. You can call me, you can email me, and every one of you is a customer of ours, even if you're not in the federal government. 80171 goes well beyond the federal government, as you know, and every one of you is a taxpayer, and we want to make sure that you're our customer. We answer your questions, and we kind of give you whatever help you need to get to where you want to go. Okay, this is where we're really trying to focus. The 80171 is hitting a niche that we didn't really have well defined previously. We have our Federal Information Security Modernization Act, FISMA, as many of you have heard of that. That started back in 2003. It was updated in 2014, but that primarily addresses federal agencies and all of the things that the feds do to protect all the information in process, transmission, and storage when it's inside the federal boundary, so to speak. But what happens when federal information goes over the fence to a non-federal organization? These are three examples of what a non-federal organization might look like. Certainly federal contractors and all the subcontractors are in that group of non-federal organizations. State, local, and tribal governments are also in that. We have a lot of partnerships the federal government has with state and local governments. For example, the IRS. Every comptroller within every state in the United States has a relationship with the IRS. And we have lots of those types of things that we deal with every day. Colleges and universities, they get a lot of grants for federal grant money to be doing research and things that are projects that the federal government wants to tap into the best and the brightest minds we can within our great academic community. So you see the reach here is pretty broad. This is the website that I just mentioned that I highly recommend you go to, and it's going to have a lot of information there that'll be very useful. For example, the first thing you want to be able to understand is, do I have CUI? Do I have controlled unclassified information? So in order to do that, you have to understand what is CUI. And there are 82 different types of categories of CUI, and they're actually broken down into subcategories. It's very well laid out, very easy to navigate that website. It also gives you a little guidance about the types of protections. Now, to make something CUI, it has to be traceable back to either a law or regulation or a government-wide policy. If it's not traceable back to one of those three things, then it's not going to be qualified as CUI. So this is a very narrowly focused set of information. But having said that, it's also information that goes out to a very wide swath of the community. The defense contracting community is huge, as I found out when we published 800-171. It's not just the prime contractors. It goes deep into the supply chain with all the subcontractors, all the way down to that lowest level mom and pop organization. Now, one of the things that's also interesting is that just because you're a small organization doesn't really mean that the information is any less valuable. That's one of the things we're going to have to get our arms around. It's very possible the DoD could have a very small company, maybe a couple of people even, that are doing cutting-edge research on a new type of defense weapon system. They're going to be very early in that life cycle that's going to mature over time, maybe even going to classified at some point, but right now it's in the R&D phase. Just because that's a two-person company, maybe working out of someone's house, that information is still important and valuable and needs protection. That's one of the conundrums that we're facing with 800-171, because it goes to the large companies, and those same requirements also go to small companies as well. And that's what a lot of people are having difficulty with. We'll talk about some strategies later on how to deal with those kind of situations. This project started out with really three big components to it. The first thing we did is that NARA produced what we call a rule or a regulation that defined the level of safeguarding for controlled unclassified information when the information was inside the federal government. That was the first thing they did. That was been a couple of years now that came out. It's 32 CFR Part 2002, if you want the reference. The next thing we had to do is produce a set of requirements that could be pointed to by the FAR or by that rule. You see, in any kind of a federal acquisition regulation, you have to have specific requirements. It can't just be a one-off thing. You can't have everybody doing their own thing across every contractor. You've got to have a set of requirements that can be approved to go into the things like the FAR or the DFARS, and that was what 171 was asked to do. We got together, it was a joint project with the Defense Department and NIST and the National Archives and Records Administration. And we had a very small team. You can look on the front cover of the document. There were 5 authors. I was one of the primary authors of the document. And we basically took what we had done previously in the NIST standards and guidelines, and we tried to pare it down to a very concise set of requirements. Now, I know what you're thinking, hey, 110 requirements doesn't sound very concise to me. But I'm going to show you today where we started. And what the feds have to do is a whole lot more than what's in 171. This is a very tight set of requirements when you see where we started. And we're going to go into all of that. Now, the DFARS kind of happened out of sequence. The Defense Department decided that they were going to activate 171. I call it Weaponizing 171 in the DFARS. That happened before it went into the FAR. The NARA is still working right now as we speak on getting the FAR clause defined and published. And when that happens, that's going to mean every federal contract is going to have the 171 requirements hardwired. Right now, it's just the DFARS. And of course, all of you are aware that the 31 December deadline is coming up on you very soon with regard to that. So the purpose of this, again, I think I covered a lot of this in my introductory remarks, but I want you to think about 171. I know there's the mundane day-to-day stuff of, hey, we got to do this by the 31st of December, but the way you approach this set of requirements is going to make your life either very, very good or very, very miserable. And it's just as simple as that. I gave you that context because even if the DFARS did not exist, the requirements in 171 are really best practices on protecting your organization in a hostile cyberspace, which we're facing today. This is about your company surviving in the 21st century. And so whether you're doing this for the DFARS purposes or whether you just want to protect your intellectual property, your corporate assets, things that matter to you, then it's going to be a good idea either way. So that's the message today. We depend on this technology. It has to be dependable. And what you do in the 171 requirements is going to help make sure that your systems, your components that you put together to give you the capability to do business every day, no matter what that business is going to make you stronger and more survivable in a very hostile world that we live in today with regard to cyber. And again, those dangers are well documented out there, and they've been around for quite some time. Controlled unclassified information is a special type of information, and where you put it in your vast IT infrastructure makes a difference. We're going to talk about that today as we go through the slide deck here. These requirements only apply to the parts of your systems, the components, where CUI is resident, and that means where it's being processed, stored, or transmitted. Now, one of the things that we discovered, and this happens in the federal government all the time, we have so many IT components and so many systems and so much information that sometimes CUI can drift into places that you didn't anticipate. One of the strategies that you can do, if you are going to be involved in processing CUI or maintaining CUI through a contract or through an agreement with an organization like the federal government, you can localize the CUI to only the people that need to be having access to that CUI. Sometimes that can be as simple as putting it on one workstation or one laptop. Now, a lot of times in the federal government, when we do our telework, the federal government will actually give us a fully provisioned laptop that has all of the protective mechanisms on that laptop. Full disk encryption, two-factor authentication, access control mechanisms, the ability to do a virtual private network connection. So the information is pretty much locked down in the environment which they're providing to us. So one of the things that we're going to struggle with is if you're a big defense contractor and you have a very small subcontractor that can't afford to do all the stuff that we're asking in the 171, there may be a need at some point to help those people and provide them the capability to actually protect the information. I can't say for every contract how that's going to work out, but sometimes if you've got those critical assets going that far down the supply chain, you may have to help out downstream. Now that cost can be reflected back up through the contract, and that's going to be, again, a cost of doing business. We're going to have to start to think of cybersecurity as a cost of doing business. It's not something that's extra that we have to do that's a cost to the business. It's going to be an investment that's going to allow us to be successful in our business and survive. That's a very different mindset because we're always looking for the ROI. Hey, if I put in this new capability or if I put in these controls, what's my return on investment? Well, the return on investment might be you get to survive tomorrow. It may be that simple. And it's not overstating the problem to say that is what we're up against today with very sophisticated adversaries. I put this slide in. This is not really part of the 800-171 slide deck, but I'm trying to give you a sense of what has to happen today to really protect systems. Every one of you has a system out there, whether it's a laptop or a tablet or a smartphone or a mainframe or something in between. They're all systems. They're all driven by computers that are actually driven by firmware and software, and you put all these things together and it gives you a capability. Now, we have ways to protect systems, but they don't always work. The first thing you do in any system is try to harden the target. And that means you deploy things that you hear about every day: firewalls, antivirus software, two-factor authentication, encryption, access controls. You do a contingency plan. You do an incident response plan. You have education. You have training so people don't fall prey to phishing attacks or open up attachments. There's a whole range of things that encompass a good cybersecurity program. That's hardening the target. But we know from over 2 decades now of looking at the threat space, and we have a lot of data today about how the adversaries try to attack and do attack our systems. We know where the attacks are coming from. We know who's launching, and we know who their targets are. And we pretty much know the success rate they're having, to include us in the federal government. We've been attacked a lot, and there's been some pretty horrific results. There's been a lot of attacks in the private sector with pretty horrific results. Some of you may be under attack right now and don't even know it, because the APT, the Advanced Persistent Threat, may be good enough where you can't even detect that they're in your system right now, and they're happily to be there as long as you'll let them. And they'll take as much from you as they possibly can until you're no longer worth anything to the adversary. So what do you do when you harden the target and you still have a cyber attack and there's a breach? That's going to happen. It happens to us, it's going to happen to you. That doesn't mean you're not doing your due diligence. Applying good controls and doing due diligence doesn't mean you're going to be breach-free. It's kind of like when you go into a court after there's been a bad episode and you get sued and you stand before the judge and you make your case that you did your due diligence. Sometimes you get into an automobile accident, it's an accident, it wasn't your fault, but if you're drinking and driving, that's a whole different story. Now when you set up your security programs and you employ all the requirements and you satisfy those requirements, some of you can satisfy 110, some maybe 100, and you're going to have a plan of action to get to the last set of requirements satisfied at some point in the future. That can be due diligence. But if you go into court after a cyber attack and a very bad breach, and the judge or the jury looks at you and says, what did you do to protect that information for your customer? And you look around and say, what's a security plan? I didn't have a security plan, I didn't deploy anything. That's one extreme, and that's not going to be looked on very favorably today. On the other hand, if you say, I had a great security plan, I have a great security program, I've deployed the controls, I've satisfied the requirements to the best of my ability, I have a continuous monitoring program, and yet I still got hit. Because sometimes the adversary is just better than you on any particular day. That's going to be looked at a whole lot differently. That's due diligence. And yes, you got hit. But that's why it's always about risk management. And there is no perfection in this game. So what do you do when something like that happens? Well, you can make your target more survivable by limiting the damage that can be done. Now in the OPM case, and this is a very important point that applies to CUI, the OPM database was 22.5 million records we lost. Now you might ask yourself, this could apply to any company. If you've got your secret sauce or whatever is critical to your company, all of that company data is in one big database that's totally accessible with one cyber attack. That's not a good thing. Separating your critical data from the day-to-day data that your company may need to use on an hourly or daily basis, that is an architectural design decision. Most of your data that any company needs every day does not need to be accessible in real time or near real time. In the OPM case, they're always doing new background investigations on people who are going to be getting security clearances. There's 5-year renewed investigations, but the vast majority of that data could have been taken offline and protected. You could even put it in a vault, and you can hire a guard in front of the vault. It makes it very hard to get that data in real time, but it also makes it hard for the adversary to get. The message here, hire a good security architect and use enterprise architecture to design your systems and networks so you can isolate controlled unclassified information to only the places where you need it, where it has to be accessible. And that message, you can take that to the next level for the rest of your corporate data as well. Don't expose all of your critical data to the internet with internet-facing applications and web apps and all the things that allow the adversary to have a clear shot at you. Make it more difficult for them to get to you. And the only way you can do that is through good architecture and good engineering. We know how to do this. We've been doing this for 40 years. We just don't apply the fundamental concepts because we're pretty much enthralled with the technology. And we want everything now. And sometimes it's more difficult to protect data. You have to realize that you can't have 100 apps on your smartphone because you don't have a clue where most of those apps came from. I've got a friend of mine that used to work at the CIA. He was actually the chief information security officer at the CIA. He runs his own company now, and they do forensics on Samsung smartphones. 80% of the Samsung phones they bring in and do forensics have malware on the phone, active malware, 80%. I'm not going to ask how many people are carrying Samsung phones out here, but 95% of those phones have evidence that malicious code has been there at some point in time. That's where we are today. That's why it's really important that you go back to an architectural construct. Building things from the start is critical. Engineering. The same reason why you get in airplanes and you go across bridges, you have confidence that when you get in that plane and when you fly, and you're going to be okay for the most part, because good engineering and good design, good architecture, good components, skilled people putting those things together result in things you can trust. We have to bring that same level of skill and trust to our information technology infrastructure. So your target has to be survivable. That's the question. That's why 171, the requirements go much beyond the DFARS. You want your company to be survivable tomorrow, and that's really a great way of looking at this problem. So how did the CUI requirements come to be? Well, we started out with the NIST standards and guidelines, and we decided that we wanted to make a set of requirements that were much more concise. So we started with our moderate baseline. Most of you who are familiar with NIST know we have the concept, I call it the triage. We have all of our systems are kind of racked and stacked into low, moderate, and high impact, where impact means if I lose that system or capability, what is the impact it has on my business or my mission? And that's where we define every system, every piece of data has a category, low, moderate, or high. The data gets categorized, and then the system takes on the categorization of the highest level of data that we're storing, processing, or transmitting. So what we did, we took all the moderate requirements, because NAR defined the moderate baseline as the minimum level of protection for controlled unclassified information. It's the mid-level, not the highest, not the lowest, somewhere in between. What we did with that is we went through all of our security controls in the moderate baseline. There were hundreds of controls. And we decided to take out everything that was uniquely federal. So our first tailoring action in our working group, we cut everything out of the moderate baseline that only the feds had to worry about. And there was a lot of things that we were able to cut out. The second thing we did, CUI is, we're worried about unauthorized disclosure. Now, those of you who are security geeks, like I am, know that security is about three things: confidentiality, protecting from unauthorized disclosure; integrity, unauthorized modification of information; and availability, having stuff ready to go when you need it. CUI and the 171 applies only to one of those objectives. It's confidentiality. So we were able to take out all of the requirements and controls from our federal standards and guidelines that were outside of the confidentiality realm. And that took a whole bunch of things off the table. So now we're making good progress. The next thing we did was kind of controversial. We said, there are things that we know we want our non-feds to do, but we're just not going to tell them to do that. It's kind of like, these are things that if you're operating an IT system in the 21st century, these are things you're doing anyway. We didn't have to tell you to do a security policy or a security plan. We thought you were already doing that. Policies, procedures, all those things, that's kind of routine for any company today, or should be. So we carved off a whole bunch of things which we want you to do, but we weren't going to tell you in the requirements that that was going to be one of the 110 that survived. That's how we tailored, and that's how we got to these 14 families. Now, those of you who are familiar with NIST know that we have 18 families in the federal set of controls and all of the things that we deal with on the federal side. So we were able to get rid of whole families of controls that just did not apply. And here's the list of the 14 that we ended up with. Things like contingency planning. That was a whole family that went away. Why? Because contingency planning, continuity of operations, deals with availability. Now, we did pick one very small control from the CP family, and it had to do with system backups. It wasn't the backup control, but it was protecting the confidentiality of the information in the backup, because that is an issue with CUI. When you back up your systems and you're backing up the CUI, you want to make sure that information is protected. That was one that survived, but these are the families now where those requirements are, that's their house. They're kind of localized in these different families, so you can have a little bit easier time in understanding how you're going to satisfy each of the requirements. So if you look at the 171, it basically has the two types of requirements. The first type are the basic requirements, and then there's something called derived requirements. Now, the distinction really is without a difference. From your perspective, they're all requirements. But the reason we separated those is the basic requirements come from a federal standard called FIPS 200. That was one of our original FISMA standards that had 17 fundamental requirements for cybersecurity that started out in 2004 or 5 timeframe. And that was one of the source documents that we used to develop the 171 requirements. So anything that has a basic label on it came primarily from the FIPS, the federal standard. The derived requirements came primarily from the security controls in our special publication 800-53. But for your purposes, it's really a distinction without a difference. This just gives you a little bit of a flavor about the differences in the types of requirements. This is one of the configuration management family sets of requirements that we have in 171, and you can see everything is laid out by number so it's you can target every requirement to a specific number. This just happens to show the two basic requirements in the configuration management family. There's 2 basic requirements, and then we have actually more than 3 derived. I just put 3 on there to give you a sense of what the derived requirements look like. You can see they're a little bit more granular than the basic requirements, but they're all to be viewed at the same level as far as, hey, I've got to do this. I've got to make sure I can satisfy every one of these requirements. Now, these 2 appendices in 171 are very important. Appendix D and E are going to really be lifesavers for you because they give you a lot of useful information. The first one, some of you maybe already have security programs that are complying with ISO standard 27001. ISO 27001, it's an international standard that has a set of requirements and actually controls like we have in our NIST catalog. But if you're doing business internationally, some of you may have committed to the ISO standard, and that's okay, that's a good thing, because you can map, in this appendix, you can map your ISO controls. You can see a mapping to our 800-53 controls in the NIST guidelines, and then you can map those back to every CUI requirement in Chapter 3 in the 800-171. So we have the mapping that takes you from the requirements in Chapter 3, all 110. You can map to the security controls in 853, and then you can go a subsequent time to the mapping in the ISO 27000. That can save you an enormous amount of work. If you've already deployed controls, you can make a credible argument that you might be able to cover most of those requirements in 171 already, and that'll save you a lot of time, effort, and expense. The other appendix is really important too, because this is going to show you for every security control in the moderate baseline. Remember, that's where we started with our moderate baseline. It's going to show you every control, how we tailored that individual control, what happened to it. Either it survived, ended up in one of the requirements in Chapter 3, or it was tailored out for some reason. And it'll give you the reason why it was tailored out. And it'll also give you the non-federal things we expect you to do that are not part of the requirements. So it's a wonderful resource to understand our thought process of how we got to those 110 requirements. I'm going to wrap up here by just giving you a couple of kind of throwaway slides here. These are things that I would do if you're trying to get your arms around the problem. these three things are pretty important. Find, isolate, and protect. Find the CUI. First of all, make sure you have CUI. Find out what CUI is and do I have it? Then if I do have it, where is it in my IT infrastructure? Try to isolate it if you can. I know that's hard sometimes, how big the project is and how much collaboration, how many people are involved. But even with larger projects, you don't have to have it everywhere. Isolate the CUI where you can, and then protect the components and the systems, the devices where the CUI resides. That's the strategy for not overcommitting too many resources and going bankrupt in this process, and doing what we call due diligence. There is a fine line. You can kind of overdo things on one side, and then the other hand, you can do things and not end up with the appropriate protection. The 110th requirement. I talk about the 3 T's, and the 110th requirement is going to really be critical. This may be the most important requirement in all 110. If you listen to nothing else today, remember the 110th requirement. We published the initial 800-171 in 2015, in June of 2015. And when we did that, we realized very quickly, the DoD actually first brought this up to our attention. It was kind of a binary thing. Either you meet all the requirements, all 109, or you're not going to be compliant and you can't enter into a contract. And so the DoD said, well, that's not good. That'll shut down the entire DoD acquisition system. That's not a good idea. We have to continue to operate. We have a defense of the country to do and all those things. So we put one more requirement in. That requirement is to do a security plan. Now, a lot of people push back and say, well, hey, 109 was enough. Why do you give us one more? This 110th requirement was done specifically to protect you as the customer out there, the people who are on the receiving end of these requirements, because it allows you to do risk management and work with your contracting officer. It does the same thing. It gives you and this whole world of CUI and the 171 the same things that every federal official manages risk every day. All of our systems are not bulletproof, as you might understand, in all the breaches that we've had. They manage risk every day. There is no perfect system. Every system has what we call residual vulnerabilities, things that are still weaknesses and deficiencies that are vulnerable that could be the subject of a threat to exploit that vulnerability to cause impact to the mission. And we accept those vulnerabilities sometimes as part of doing business. We just can't get to green totally. So what happens now, the 110th requirement is a requirement to do a security plan, and that's where you get to tell your story. You get to come back to the federal contracting officer and say, of the 110 requirements, if they ask you for your security plan, that's where you tell your story. I've met 110, of the 110 requirements, I've met 105, and there are 5 that I haven't met yet, but I'm going to get there in this time frame, and I'm giving you my plan of action to get there. That's a pretty good deal. You can say, I can't do 2-factor authentication today, but I have an acquisition in, and I'm going to be 2-factor ready in about 6 months, because it takes a while to procure stuff. It takes a while to implement new controls and satisfy certain technology-related requirements especially. It may take a while to develop a policy or procedures that you have to put into place to make sure the program that you're trying to develop is full, robust, and is going to do the job. Now, they can take that plan of action in your security plan. By the way, you have to describe your network and your systems and what you're connected to. It gives the contracting officer a sense of where you are today. And they can also decide, hey, is the CUI that I'm sending you, can I make a risk-based decision that I'm going to still enter into the contract with you, because the CUI, even though it all is moderate level and we say it's all the same, it's not all the same. One of the jokes we use working with the DoD is the Pentagon paving contractor. They are actually under the requirements of the CUI, but the Pentagon paving contractor is probably not handling CUI that's critical. On the other hand, what if you're a defense contractor, that small mom and pop organization I talked about, with 2 scientists from MIT? that are working on cutting edge technology, that's a small organization, and they're working on some really important stuff. And that CUI is pretty darn important, pretty sensitive, even at the early stages of the development process. Now the contracting officer can look at those two situations differently. And they can say, I'm willing to take that chance, knowing that I can come back to you in 6 months and say, you told me with your plan of action you're going to get to this point in 6 months. Now I can come back and say, did you get there? And so you see, they have the ability now to make those kind of risk-based decisions. That's critical, because now the DoD entire acquisition system is not going to shut down. And that's risk management. That's why that 110th requirement is really critical. Those 3 T's are good to remember, even if you didn't have to deal with the DFARS. They're all important: transparency, traceability, and trust. When you're doing your requirements and you're going to do a self-assessment and you're going to go back and say, here's where I am today, you're going to produce evidence to show why you can make the claim that you've met all 110 requirements. Could be a self-assessment, could be an independent third-party assessment. You may hire someone to come in and do an assessment. But the bottom line is you want to have transparency. The contracting officer needs to understand, if I'm going to do business with you, we're a partnership now, because you're doing important things for the government, and we are either going to sink or swim as a team. And that's pretty important today. This, we versus them mentality is very destructive. We have to, everything we do great as a country, we do in the public-private partnership. And that goes back decades, going back to the space program in the 60s, when we did that great moon launch that we did back in 1969. Public-private partnership. Transparency, traceability leads to trust. And that's what you want to develop with your contracting officer, with the organization that you're dealing with. If you have that trust, it's a beautiful thing. It's almost like trusting your kids or your family members. And I think we're getting close. Is that a 5-minute mark now? I think we're getting down to the end here. Move to the cloud. Here's something else that's kind of a well-kept secret. The federal government has a program of cloud computing called FedRAMP. And they have a moderate capability. So if you go to the public cloud today, you can actually cover the vast majority of those requirements in 800 and 171, because the 171 requirements were derived from the moderate baseline. They're a subset of the moderate baseline. So going to the FedRAMP approved cloud services, whether it's platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, or software as a service, that's a good solution. And you're working with your contracting officer to see if that's a viable solution. That can take a lot of worry out of some of these smaller organizations. And by the way, going to the cloud, it's also a great deal because you can do a lot more with a lot less. You can provision services on an on-demand basis. You don't have to own all of your components today. You can provision them from the cloud, and there's pretty good protections in the cloud that can offer you a lot of peace of mind in that regard. Here's a couple of things that you could use as you start to look at assessing your requirements. The 171 Alpha, we just published that last week. It's an assessment guideline that you can use to help determine if you're meeting the requirements in 171. It's kind of based on one of our other publications, 800-53 Alpha. There's an assessment guideline that we've had for years on assessing our security controls. That is out there for you. You can develop your assessment plans. It's a really good, there's also this great handbook that one of our people at NIST developed to support the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, the MEP program. A lot of you might be familiar with that program. That handbook is like a questionnaire. It's a really good conversational resource that you can use to get started on the task of developing the evidence so you can show that you're complying with the requirements. Well, I mentioned this team sport. That's pretty darn important today. And I know that a lot of you, maybe from the academic community, some of you from industry, government, this is the essential partnership that has to come together. We talked earlier about cybersecurity and the importance of cyber today. We have to get this right. If we don't get this right, the country, and I can't overstate this, the country is at great risk today if we don't get our act together on the cybersecurity front, because we are literally tethered to this technology so tight that we could lose everything by not doing our due diligence, not just in the federal government. We have a long way to go there as well. We're not perfect by any means. But the public and private partnership, the ability for the private sector to protect itself as well, critical infrastructure, all of our wonderful companies out there. If we don't get this right, then the country that we have today, the security and privacy that we had for the last 3 decades, you are not going to recognize the country that you're going to leave to your children and your grandchildren. So with that, I want to thank you again for coming today, for being patient through this long presentation. There's our contact information. Don't be shy. You paid a lot of money for all these documents as taxpayers. We're there to help you, to serve you, and we really value all of the work that you're doing today to make your companies more secure. Thank you guys very much. Hope you have a great panel session. Have a great day. Do we have a couple of, I know we have to, there's a panel coming up. I want to be respectful of the time for the panelists and everything. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a great plan to isolate part of my system to control CUI.
Right.
And then I was talking to one of our team members at NIST SP to have CUIs delivered. If it's just emailed to him, all of a sudden, anything with his work email, his laptop, his phone, my ability to then isolate that goes
Yeah.
down the drain. So I guess how would you recommend it?
Well, the question is about, a typical organization. We have a lot of stuff, right? We have the tablets, we have smartphones, we have laptops, we have workstations. How do you isolate the CUI if you're kind of doing business as usual? It's not easy, but it can be done. Isolating CUI, for example, if you're going to send email with CUI, it needs to be encrypted. There are encryption programs that are available to make sure that information can be in any one of 3 states. It can be in process within the computer, whether it's a smartphone or a laptop or wherever it is. It can be in transit over the network, and it can be at rest. So there are ways to protect the CUI in all 3 of those states. You just have to, through an architectural design, make sure you can understand where that CUI is located at any point in time. Sometimes it's going to require some discipline to make sure that, hey, we can't just do business as usual with CUI. We're going to have to operate a little bit differently sometimes with that type of information. That's why there are ways to protect email, even when you're using a standard email system. We have, for example, in the FedRAMP program, there are email applications that are part of a cloud that inherit all the fundamental controls and protections that are part of that cloud computing under FedRAMP. I'm not saying you're going to use that email application in the cloud, but that would be a design decision that you have to involve the architects and the engineers who are actually putting together all your capability within your organization. And I can say it's not easy. It takes some thought and analysis to figure out exactly how CUI flows in a typical organization. And so that initial step of understanding how things move is a very important first step. Once you understand that, then you can start to say, well, how can I constrain or limit or scope this down to the devices I need to scope it down to. That's my first, what I would do first.
It's more about when our contracting officer sends it to us.
Well, by the way, they're not off the hook either. The federal government, when they send you the CUI, has an obligation to protect it from their side when it comes to you. And so that's something else that you have to be, sometimes the feds, when they're doing acquisition work, they're not cybersecurity people, so sometimes they're in no better shape than you are as far as understanding what they have to do. And that's a problem for us. We have to make sure that our contracting officers understand their obligations as well. Again, it's a partnership. You can't just throw this stuff over the fence and say it's your problem. They have to work with you. They're obligated to work with you to make sure that you have the tools, the techniques, the methods that you need to be successful. Because if you're not successful, they're not successful. So, yes, sir.
Two questions, quick ones, I think. First is, do you have any timeline on when this would be applicable to all federal contractors? And then secondly, have you engaged with our allies? Is this something that's being exported to other countries?
Yes, the first question about the timeline for the general FAR clause, it's supposed to be sometime in 2018. It was supposed to be 2017, but as you can see, we're almost at the end of 2017. I work fairly closely with the National Archives and Records Administration. They are, again, the executive agent. They're actively working on that FAR clause. It's going to be a clause for the FAR. And I would expect you're going to see that sometime in 2018, hopefully not on the far side, but the near side of 2018. As far as international goes, yes, we are seeing a lot of engagement. The fact that DoD, is part of military alliances around the world, this is part of that bubble. When you throw the rock in the water, it ripples everywhere. So when it goes in the DFARS, it gets into NATO, it gets into all those. We've had a lot of interaction. The DoD has had a lot of interaction with our allies. And the 171 requirements, because they are a central part of the DoD strategy, are making their way to our allies as well. And I think that's just going to be, like I said to someone yesterday, the 171 has surprised me in a lot of ways. This document may do more to raise the bar for cybersecurity in general, even if the DFARS didn't exist. But the fact it's in the DFARS, it is percolating to places that the DFARS doesn't even cover. Like the colleges and universities now, who are sometimes complying, even if they don't have to. They're starting to see the handwriting on the wall. It's just good best practice. So yes, I think it's going to affect worldwide. And luckily it's tied back to the ISO 27001, and we try to have some level of compatibility where we can. We don't want to be new starting everything, because you don't have enough time and energy and resources to do new starts all the time. So, anybody else? Yeah, Lisa? Yes, 27,001, when he says doesn't apply, we put the mapping table in there for a specific reason. We know that a lot of our private sector partners some have, done what we call 27,001 certs. They actually, you design a scope of applicability and you go through all the controls, and then you implement those controls under 27,001, and then you can hire a company to come in and see if you did the job correctly. They can give you a cert. And so if you do that and you have that documentation, you can then take that and say, what are all the controls in 27,001 that I actually can show evidence that I've complied with? And you can reverse engineer that. You can go back and say, okay, this 27,001 control applies to this NIST control, and that applies to this CUI requirement. So you can develop that mapping, which to me, it's a level of indirection, but it provides you with a body of evidence that you can go back to the contracting officer and say, hey, we've already done this. Is that acceptable to you? Now, if they're going to accept your self-assessment, then, why wouldn't they accept that? Now, it depends on, again, on the level of sensitivity of the CUI. Obviously, these are going to be one-off decisions. But if you've done that, that's a great way to start. And you may find yourself a whole lot better off than someone starting from ground zero. So I encourage people to do mappings as much as they can and reuse as much information as you can from previous assessments if the contracting officer will accept that. Yes, sir.
We've had any discussions with DoD about the compliance aspect of this, other than the self-assessments, where they're going to get the resources, who's going to do it, or is it all going to be finale-based?
We've had lots of discussions with the DoD on compliance going way back to the start of 171. We made a design decision that we were going to carve off assessments and compliance from the initial 171. That was going to be a different discussion. And then we came up with 171 Alpha just this past week. That was our first NIST foray into that world of assessment. My sense is that the DoD understands this problem implicitly. They know this is why I think, and I can't speak for them, so what I'm saying to you is just my sense of what they're doing. They're going to be pretty happy with self-assessments where you make a claim on what you've done. They're going to have your security plan. They're going to have your plan of action. They're going to have all that information you'll be giving them to include your self-assessment, because that's one of the controls to do an assessment. And then they'll be able to have that body of evidence back and they can make their decisions. Now, they may at some point have individual contracts where they say, we want to go one step further. We want you to go out and have an independent assessment of your system that has that CUI. But that would be probably the exception rather than the rule, because look at, ultimately, if they require you to do an independent assessment, who do you think is going to pay for that? It's going to be the DoD, right? I mean, you're going to work that back into the cost of doing business, which I would expect you would do. Nobody works for free in any business. So 171 Alpha is going to give you, again, a tool, even if you do a self-assessment, to produce evidence that is disciplined, structured, that you can bring into court if you have to ever get that point. I hope you don't. But it's going to be a part of this transparency that we talked about. Traceability, transparency, leading to trust. Self-assessment, independent assessment, and hopefully the government doesn't ever send a team down there to do it themselves. But again, if you've got a high-end defense contract, that may be something that happens occasionally. So there's a whole spectrum of how assessments can go down and how compliance can be looked at. But right now, I think it's mostly self-assessments. Do we have time for one more? Okay, and then we got to get to the panel.
My question about the CY documents themselves, existing files and new files. So I think they're marked FOUO or sensitive unclassified. Do we have to consider those CY and any new documents like say project statuses? Do we have to train our individuals to have to marking the character person on line yards?
Yes, that's it. The question about marking and what do you do with old stuff and new stuff. So obviously all the new stuff is going to be under the CUI program. So every data type that is under the new CUI, that should be traceable back to one of those CUI categories in the CUI registry. That's not a problem. That's pretty clear. The question comes up, what about all the old stuff that used to be marked SBU, FOUO? That's going to be an individual discussion with your contracting officer because there is a lot of CUI that you could say retroactively should be CUI but it's marked FOUO or SBU or one of the hundreds of other types of markings that we used before. There's going to be a transition period where all that stuff's going to have to be reviewed and see if it falls under the new CUI umbrella. The stuff that does not, move it off the table. The stuff that does, that's going to probably have to be remarked and brought in under the protection regime of the new program. So I would look at that as an individual discussion with your contracting officer and just don't get overwhelmed with the enormity. Try to bite off small pieces and handle one thing at a time so you can make forward progress. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Ron, thank you very much for your insightful remarks. And he is so busy, he's got to get back to the Maryland area. But we appreciate you taking the time, and this was great. And we also appreciate your willingness to have people contact you with questions as they go along. So thank you. We're going to take a 2 to 3 minute break. Go get coffee. Stand in place while we bring the panel up here. All right, everybody, we're going to get started again. I know there's a few people who will be coming in, but in the sake of time, we'll get started. I'm Molly McGee. I'm the Executive Director of the Southeastern New England Defense Industry Alliance, and we are extremely pleased to be one of the partners for this event, this very important event. We started off with Ron, who gave outstanding insight. And again, I encourage people, take advantage. He gave you his cell phone number, he gave you his email, reach out. But now we've got an outstanding panel that's really going to focus on practical approaches to implementing the NIST 171 requirements. And I have the honor of introducing the moderator for the panel. Matt Salina is the CEO of CyberScout. CyberScout is a best-in-class provider of data and identity defense systems. And this is very important, so they focus on proactive protection, education, as well as successful resolution. They have companies in North America as well as Western Europe, and Matt was also chosen by Governor Raimondo to be a member of her Rhode Island Cybersecurity Commission. So Matt, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, everybody. A pleasure to be here, and thanks, Molly, who is well-renowned as well for her work on cybersecurity issues here. We just listened to a real American hero. Dr. Ross is in the world, you don't find many people with that caliber of experience and dedication to the cause, and the reason why I asked the question about exporting what he does is every country could use Dr. Ross and the teams that he works with. And these NIST standards, when you look at them, are generally just good old best practices, but it's hard to get people off the couch to really focus on them and get them done when they're voluntary. And I think his use of the word weaponizing is a perfect term for what we're doing with what we're going to talk around today. If you didn't know, Rhode Island is a great place for experts around cybersecurity, and we're going to hear from a whole bunch of them today. So the way we're going to work this is I'm going to make some introductions for the 6 panelists. They're going to do a 5-minute intro each, just talking about kind of framing the issue, and then we're going to get into some questions that I'll pose, and then we're going to get into some questions from the audience. So let's dive in. We're going to work from my right to left. First off, it's Nancy Bixby. Nancy is the Chief Executive Officer and Project Manager of Bixby Consulting Group. With her broad background on both operations and compliance, she provides a holistic viewpoint to implementing and managing controls in a practical and efficient way. Welcome, Nancy. Michael Carmack is a cybersecurity analyst working for Right Solutions in Middletown. His primary responsibilities involve ensuring protection of Right security infrastructure, which include extensive remote use of resource and compliance with all NIST requirements. And Michael is also a Salve graduate. Another Salve guy, Brandon Catalan. Brandon is a professor at Salve Regina in the Department of Justice, Administration of Justice and Homeland Security, and he also is a faculty fellow at the Pell Center, and much background in government and academia. Chris Michaud. Chris is the Chief Technology Officer for McLaughlin Research and the founder of Nectar Labs. Definitely, when we're done today, would love to have you kind of see what Nectar's been working on. It's really fascinating stuff, especially as it talks to mandatory compliance with the NIST standards. Dr. Suzanne Miller is a principal at Citrin Cooperman in the firm's Rhode Island office, and she is an active member of the cybersecurity practice within technology and risk advisory consulting. And finally, Stephen Ucci. Stephen is an attorney with Adler, Pollack, and Sheehan and represents domestic and international clients in a variety of transactional matters, especially in cyber. He's one of the foremost legal experts on cyber in the state today. So, round of applause to the panelists. And we'll get started with the intros, and Nancy, if you don't mind, taking it on.
Okay, so I have my own business. I do consulting work, working with defense contractors. My background has been with financial industry. If you're not aware, banks have had to comply with these types of requirements for over 10 or 15 years, needing to have all the controls in place and also, more importantly, evidence of those controls. So I've been working with the banks through those years. Right now, I figure there's a mix of people in this room where some are saying, geez, I think I'm all set. I did the assessment. I'm just here to kind of do a checkup. And then there's a bunch of others that are sitting on maybe a sinking ship saying, oh, God, that 1231 is coming up. What am I going to do? What do I have to do? And so hopefully today you'll get an idea. There are some critical things you have to do to comply to meet that 1231 deadline. There's also ways to simplify it. I think what we could do is get those self-assessments in place. They naturally build into the security plan, so just so you have something to be able to give to your contracting officers or to be able to show that you're aware of it. When you're being audited or being asked for it, if you were to say, oh, gee, yeah, I got that memo, I haven't looked at it, what's that going to do? Raise every red flag. So what I think our plan here today is to kind of give you those tools so that you can be able to respond with something that shows that you're aware of the issues, you're aware of what controls need to be in place. You may not be 100% compliant, you might only be 20%, but at least you know where your deficiencies are, and you can map out a plan on how to get there. And I think by 1231, that's what you absolutely need to have in place in order to ensure that your contracts, you're meeting that DFARS clause. So I guess my role today is to kind of help you navigate this. There's a lot of buzzwords. But when it comes down to it, it's something that's achievable.
Thanks, Nancy. And Mike, we'll turn to you.
Again, I'm Michael Carmack. I work at Right Solutions, pretty much running the internal IT security for all Right Solutions assets and data, intellectual property, PII, and everything that we produce in terms of government contracts. So about 2 years ago, I got the tag you're it with the 800-171 when it came down the pipeline. We had about a bunch of people in the office sending emails to me and to other people saying, hey, this just popped up, 800-171. What is this all about? And everyone initially thought, this is just an IT initiative. There's tons of requirements, and a lot of them look like they're IT requirements. That's IT department's job. So it was IT department's job, and we were supposed to keep our heads down and start doing the requirements. And we quickly realized that 800-171 is absolutely not an IT initiative. This is an entire organizational corporate initiative. It touches end users, it touches senior management, it touches how you're going to run business from here into the future. As a small company, we were really focused on being efficient and being productive, but Right Solutions wasn't built with cybersecurity in mind. And efficiency and productivity don't go hand in hand with security. There's going to be trade-offs. So when you start looking at how you're going to meet these requirements, you have to understand there might be a slight culture change. Cybersecurity is going to have to become a part of your culture, not something that's baked on top. You need senior management support. If you don't have senior management support, you're not going to become 800-171 compliant, and you should just get out of the industry. So the first thing I had to do, it's true, you really need it. The first thing I had to do was identify CUI. What was CUI and where was CUI in our business? Because I needed some type of scope and something to lean on. What was our operational environment? What were things, where was our data residing and how is it connecting to the other systems in our environment? And I had to look at how am I going to become compliant with requirements that I haven't even looked at. So I looked at something that we had done previously as a system engineering and software development company, which is CMMI Capability Maturity Level 3, which is essentially tons of process areas you have to become compliant with that are audited. So I wrote down all the requirements. At the time there were 109. That 110th one got tacked on later, which is the most important one, like the speaker said earlier. So I wrote down all the requirements, and I made sure that I understood what the level of commitment and the level of resource that we're going to need to meet the requirements. Was it going to be a documentation fix? Are we going to have a policy and procedure in place to just satisfy that? Because not everything can be a technical implementation. Are we going to have to procure something? So we had a checkbox for, is our procurement needed? What are the resources we have available in terms of man hours and also in terms of financial support from senior management? After I did that, I realized what we need to do is a gap analysis and a risk assessment of what we currently have and what we don't have. And we used our risk assessment to drive how we were going to become compliant by December 31st of this year. So when December 31st hits, the most important things in our arsenal, if someone comes down on us and says, hey, are you guys compliant? It's going to be the system security plan. That's an absolute necessity. It's going to be your POAM, your plan of action and milestones, which your gap analysis will show where you're missing requirements and what you have to do to become compliant. You need to have a roadmap ahead of how you're going to become compliant. And if you're not, or if you're going to tailor it out, it has to be approved by the contracting office. Once you have all of those things, that's when you can sit back and really focus on getting the requirements met by following your timeline. If you don't have a timeline, you don't have a risk assessment, there's no way that you have any direction of how you're going to put your IT resources or how you're going to get your users trained on 35 new policies if you're a small business that never had a BYOD policy or never had a policy on removable device encryption. We were looking through our documentation and we had over 35 either new or refreshed documents that came down the pipeline just because of 800-171. And you can't just write these policies and put them in a book. End users have to be trained. All staff at all levels have to be trained. Because again, this isn't just IT sitting in the back. Right Solutions is a small company, 240 employees, 3 IT staff. But it takes all 240 employees to remain compliant with 800-171 and to meet compliance by December 31st and moving on with your POAM.
Thanks, Mike. A true example of a guy who was handed a bag of lemons and will be selling lemonade after the sessions today. I'm remiss not to thank the Pell Center, which I meant to thank at the beginning of this session for putting this on today, for Teresa Haas and Dr. Ludis, and especially Francesca Spitaglieri, who is here in the cloud watching over us from Italy. So moving on to Brandon.
Thanks. My name is Brandon Catalan. Teach at Salve, humbled to be a Pell Center Fellow. Prior to coming to Salve, I worked for a little over 10 years for large defense contractors in the intelligence community, mostly in the classified space, doing some offensive operations and a lot of CND, cyber network defense. So usually I get people panic attacks when I start talking or briefing because I just basically give doomsday nightmare scenarios, which happen every day. So I think I'm here mostly to answer, incident response questions. What happens when there is a compromise? Full disclosure, I don't know much about NIST compliance or DFARS. I actually really don't care too much about it. I just care about how I could basically compromise a network and more easily get in. Basically, I was an attacker for a while, so I think like an attacker. A lot of the cyber network defense work that I did was counter-Chinese, counter-Iranian, and more recently some of the North Korean activity that's been spiking up. So I think some of the questions I will answer pertain to what is a compromise, what happens when you do have a compromise, what are the different kinds of compromises that could happen, and then answer any questions that you guys may have.
Thanks, Brandon. Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Michaud. My primary role is McLaughlin Research. I'm in charge of the technology and IT. And then I also kind of founded the Nectar Labs with a lot of help. Nectar Labs actually started from the mistakes we originally made trying to become NIST compliant and understanding NIST, and we ended up developing products to help us become compliant, and that's what formed that side of it. I ran into a lot of same challenges as Mike. This ended up for us, it's not just an IT thing, and I originally thought it was. It requires everyone, including your executives, your leadership, they have to have buy-in. It's one of the most important things. You can't do this alone. The other thing, I can answer questions about mistakes we made, how we rectified them, things to do moving forward. But another big deal is you want to approach this, don't get scared from it. Take a pragmatic and a holistic approach to it. And we can talk about focusing on progress, not perfection. This isn't something you're just going to do and get done with and it's over. This is the way you do business now. It's the way you're going to operate moving forward. And I can help answer questions based on our own experience with that.
Thanks, Chris. Suzanne?
I would say good morning, but I think we're getting very close to the afternoon here. My name is Suzanne Miller, and I have just recently joined Citrin Cooperman, which is a CPA firm in probably 15 locations across the Northeast. And before that, I was with a company where we had 36 locations across the United States with some international touch. I was brought in to help Citrin Cooperman, CPA firm, trusted advisor, to expand their cybersecurity practice. And in case you don't know it, today the AICPA has added cybersecurity to CPA firms because of the fact that financial reporting and the assurance that your financial reports are accurate is not ticking and tying back. Somebody could actually be hacking into systems and changing data. Financial report comes out and let's change it back to where it was before. And maybe somebody will figure out whether I did it or not. So that being said, you're going to see lots of other CPA firms doing the same thing because the AICPA has come out. I happen to not be a CPA. I am ISACA certified, and you probably have no clue what that means. It's a certified information security auditor, certified in risk, certified in security management. I am on the security assurance side. I think it's important for you to understand that there's IT that makes it work, there's information security that protects it, and then there's information assurance that validates that the controls that were put in place to protect the IT assets are operating effectively. Those are different things. So when you take a look at compliance, and I've been doing compliance ever since HIPAA came out way back when. So when you take a look at the world of compliance, it's your job, when you see compliance, it's data. And every compliance, whether it's HIPAA, whether it's payment card industry, whether it's Graham-Leach-Bliley, which has to do with banks, any of the areas, including CUI, that's data. Compliance is around protecting that data and securing that data. So that being said, you're looking at three things around that data: the people, the processes, and the technology. And when you talk about it not being an IT thing, people, processes, and technology. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But once you figure out what data you have, and if you need to keep it, because if you don't, you should get rid of it. But now you need to map it so you know the people, the processes, and the technology. And those are the items that need to be in scope for you to perform this particular compliance. The goal is for you, when you do compliance, it's not what you do today for your business. Your goal today is, I need to make the best product and have the greatest services out there. And I need to do the best that I can to respect and honor and show my customers how much I care about that. Today, another focus. You have to focus like a bad guy. You don't, when we talk about compliance, you don't look at it from what you're doing. Well, we do a good job with this. We have great policies. No, you need to look at it from the bad person's perspective. What's the risk of them getting in? How can they get in? And only you know that in your company. How can they get in? And then how can you reduce them getting in? Maybe you need to close up another port on your firewall. But instead of looking at it from, well, I need to look at my firewall and make sure it's closed. No, from the bad person perspective, what can they do? How can they get in? And those are your risks, and you need to evaluate them. If they get in, what have you done to reduce your exposure? If you've got all this data everywhere, you have huge exposure. So you need to work from a risk management perspective of how can they get in and reduce that risk? And if they do get in, how can you reduce your exposure at that particular point? We'll talk further.
Thanks, Suzanne. Stephen?
Great, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Pell Center. Thank you, Sanidia. Thank you, Nectar Labs and McLaughlin Research for putting this on. My name's Stephen Uche. I'm one of the lawyers that's crawled out of the muck because the standard came in. And my interest in cybersecurity goes back to the 80s when a young man from Seattle hacked into NORAD and attempted to launch a thermonuclear war across the United States. Of course, I'm talking about war games. DOD's been dealing with this issue for many, many years. And now it's gotten to the point where our systems are so vulnerable that drastic action had to be taken. And now you all are here to learn are you part of the cyber army? As a lawyer who does government contracts and has always had an interest in cybersecurity, it's kind of a natural fit to start to work through these issues with you. So what's been amazing is that in the last 90 days, how much so many parts of the government have woken up to realize everyone needs help. There's definitely been an increase in the realization that this deadline is coming. It will not be pushed off. So I just want everyone who has a pen available, and I will give this to you after, is DODprocurementtoolbox.com. So DODprocurementtoolbox.com is a DOD website that has a cybersecurity tab that has videos and guidance, and this is something very few people know about. I'm being one of them, even though I've been speaking about this. But more and more things are coming up. So DODprocurementtoolbox.com. Secondly, Polaris MEP here in Rhode Island, on their website, tremendous workbook that is in there that can help map this out if you haven't done so already. So while you have 25 days to be compliant, go on there, download the workbook, and start working through that. It has some really good practical advice and tips in there on how to implement this performance-based standard. And again, a performance-based standard means that you have to look at how you operate and what your relative means are in order to become compliant, in order to have a solution. The solution for Raytheon and Northrop Grumman in General Dynamics is very different than the solution for most of you in this room. And I believe my editorial comment on all this is it's crept up on us because the major defense contractors have been doing this already. And this isn't anything for them to be worried about. They have the systems and the resources to fully implement everything that's in there, and they have done such. And because they have such sway, I don't think anyone's realized what a burden this has been on small business, probably until the last 90 days when so many folks have raised their hands. But I will tell you that there is now, and this is something that concerned me, clear guidance from DOD that says having a cybersecurity plan in place and documenting your deficiencies and having a POAM to meet them will show you are compliant. Now, that doesn't relieve you from doing an audit and assessing your systems and putting things in place that are reasonable, but it also doesn't have a gun to your head for December 31st. So you can still go through this, understand what you are. And again, a POAM, has to have a plan of action and milestones, meaning you can't say, here are my deficiencies, someday I'll get to them. You have to have a plan based upon your business that's reasonable. So once you have that in place, and that was an important update that was in the December 2016 rev of the NIST standard. One of the things I caution clients about is to make sure that that is what is in your contract. So DOD has come out and said, for folks who have a clause, a 7012 clause, and that predates December 16, that they need to have a contract mod in place to show that that is, in fact, the NIST standard that they'll be working with, that they'll be working with Rev 1, not with the older one, because the older one didn't allow for your ability to play catch-up. It basically said you have to have all of these things in place. That's been documented in many places. I have that documentation in hard copy, so in case we have some errant contracting officer or someone saying, no, you have to have all of these things done, DOD has clearly come out and said, we get it, we understand people have to do this, but they really want you to do the assessment and have things in place. So as you go forward on these contractual things, some of the things I answer questions on are, what happens after December 31st? What is going to happen? What will your requirements be? What are the consequences if you aren't fully compliant and something happens? So those are the things I'd welcome your questions on as we go further. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Stephen. My company does business at a better part of the world, and if there's any level of encouragement, you guys are the first to have this level of stringent regulatory requirement than we've seen anywhere on the globe. And so it's truly the first best practices we've seen that have been implemented to this degree. The state of New York has implemented something similar for companies that file, public companies that file in the state of New York around best practices, board level visibility into cyber issues, et cetera. But to this granularity level of degree, this is the first of its kind, and you would have to think that it's going to be a precursor for a lot of governments moving in this direction, let alone not just in the U.S., but everywhere. So let's keep this loose. So if you have questions as we go along, just raise your hand and we'll incorporate them. And to the panelists, I'm going to be posing some general questions to each panelist. If you have something to add, if you want to fill in some other gap on the statement, please do so. So we're going to ping pong back to Nancy. And Nancy, let's start with the basics. We're going to talk about what is CUI.
Well, it's a good question. If Ron had mentioned that website that was a registry, and you can just Google CUI registry, and it's really great. It's got probably 25 different industries, so if you're in healthcare, if you're in agriculture, it's great because it does show you what could be considered CUI, but it's not great because it almost looks like everything you get is CUI. So it's really hard. It's hard to know how can I parse it down. One other suggestion Ron had was if you could put it as a standalone workstation, then you can put your CUI on that and control that, but that's not really practical in most applications. So in the banking world, what we've had to do is we've had to protect confidential customer information, and we've kind of had to apply those guidelines across the board. Unless you can put it all on just one controlled system, you can have a controlled network, you really have to apply the guidelines. So I guess that's the good news and the bad news. The good news, there is a registry. We can go in and look at it and see, gee, what would be considered, it's system specs and plans and certain documents on manufacturing items. But it could also, depending on the industry, could have something to do with some agriculture, pesticides or growth rates or something. So it really depends on the industry. The other thing, what I've worked with some of my clients is go back. I primarily work with subprime contractors. Go back to your prime contractor. Say, hey, what do you guys consider CUI, or it's actually CDI is really the term that's kind of the more appropriate term these days. What do you consider CDI that we're handling? Ideally, if they're sending you something, it should have the classification on it. I was looking at documents this past week because it's just something you don't always, you don't pay attention to. And I've looked to see if I could find not at least for the companies I'm working with, I couldn't find anything in there that with an email coming in or a purchase order coming in or a work order or a statement of work where it actually had any designation on it. I mean, ideally, that's where it should be. So again, there is a registry, you can go and look. Chances are you've got stuff that's got CUI on it or CDI. If you have questions, though, I would go back to your prime contractor and say, hey, what are you looking to protect? That also helps scope it down a little bit so that you can kind of define it a little bit better. So it doesn't really answer. So as I said, there's a registry to go see what CUI, CDI is, but at the end of the day, almost a majority of your work, your data will actually probably be classified.
Thanks. And Mike, you started to frame out the minimum requirements. Want to flesh that out, put a little bit more color on that?
Yeah, so I think you've heard it probably about 3 times now, but 4th time might be good to stick. So by December 31st, you definitely want to have a system security plan in place. And that's basically how you're meeting the requirements that you're meeting. And you also want a risk assessment in place, which is going to define the scope of where CUI lives in your environment. It's going to identify, the likelihood of something occurring and the impact of the malicious impact or intent of it occurring in your environment and what that would do and what you would have to do to prevent that. And that'll be a good framework to understand where the gaps are in between the 800-171, 109 requirements, the ones you're meeting and the ones you're not. And that kind of ties you into the POAM, which again, is just the plan of action and milestones. You want to define your deficiency. You want to kind of spell out the resources that are going to be required to meet the requirement. So if it's 100 man hours and a technical procurement, what milestones you need to hit, what's the end date, and you need to make sure that if you do have deficiencies that the contracting office is aware of those. They've signed off on them, and then you also let them know once you've met the requirement. If, like you said, revision 2, if that was the DFARS that you have in your contract that was either as a prime or flowed down as a subcontractor, that makes you compliant. You don't have to hit all 110 by December 31st. You just need to make sure you have a way ahead, and the contracting office is aware of that way ahead so that they're accepting the risk appropriately through an informed decision.
Thanks. Brandon, we're going to skip you for a minute. We're going to hold the war stories back for a second and maybe just talk about, Chris, I know you've been on this journey for months and months and months. Talk to us about the journey, the mistakes maybe that some of the mistakes you made, some of the lessons learned, and have you reached the mountaintop? Where are you right now?
Yeah, so I'll start with my initial interpretation of this, which was very wrong. I thought this was not a big deal a couple of years ago. I thought we would just kind of tweak some policies and do some security enhancements and be good. And I was so confident in myself, I had an external risk assessor come audit us, and they tore us apart, specifically on the policies. So, nobody's perfect, and, we thought we were pretty good. And the first thing I learned was you actually need to decode what the NIST requirements are asking for, what you can get away with, what you can't get away with, and what you need to do, like your POAM, the critical things you need by the end of the year. So that was one of my mistakes at first. The other thing was I thought, like I said before, I thought this was going to be just an IT implementation, and it wasn't. It was the farthest from that. And one of our biggest issues, which, how do you mark all your CUI documents? How do you determine what it is? And one thing we found that was helpful in determining that was we talked with our peers who are also our competitors. You have to reach out on the IT side and the compliance side. You're not competing on contracts. You need to work together, talk with your peers. You might think something is going to be done one way. They might have another way. you're gonna meet in the middle somewhere, you know, you're gonna learn to see how other people are doing it. These controls are pretty vague, you know, there's a lot of interpretation, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it. So anyway, to get back to, so we started, I made some mistakes at first, but as we learned more, what I found was just understanding, decoding what they're asking for, understand what they're asking for, and identify what you can do, what's easy for you, you know, depending on your capabilities in your IT group and your other people. What can you get done? Attack that stuff, do the low-hanging fruit, and then put your plans together on, you know, okay, I can't do this now, like dual-factor authentication or something, but right to it, understand, you know, you can't do it now, maybe the risk isn't very high at this point. You know, so take a step back, don't freak out, don't panic, but take a pragmatic and holistic approach. You want to focus on, like, progress with this, not perfection. That's probably the most important thing I can tell you. And again, reach out to your peers and talk with your competitors, see what they're doing, how are they addressing it. You're going to learn a lot. I reach out to Mike several times. You know, he understood some things that I wasn't interpreting properly, and that was a big help. We've talked with C Corp as well, just our neighbors in the corporate park. So don't be afraid to reach out. So that's, you know, kind of our journey to that. So once we started digging into it deeper, what I found was, you know, you need resources, you need people, and that's expensive. So I found millennials are readily available.
And available in any store.
Anywhere.
You know, we actually, initially, we reached out using the Synedia intern program. These are students who are eager, they're in the cybersecurity programs. They're not afraid to, you know, be locked in a room, and, you know, you can tell them not to come out until they know what NIST is. I'm not making this stuff up. This is
They are locked in a room with no windows, right?
But these are, you know, these new young students, they're a great resource to actually help decode what you need to do. They can understand it. You know, I'm busy during the day putting out fires as an IT guy from McLaughlin. You know, there's a lot of things that you just can't put the resources to, but don't be afraid to use interns. Explain to them what you want to accomplish, help them, and you'll find they're gonna, if they're good, they're gonna be a big part of your company over time, and they can help maintain this stuff moving forward. That was another big deal for us, you know, is these young new people, get them in there and have them help you with it. They want to learn, and it's a big deal for them. So, as of now, you know, we're not perfect. I don't think there's ever such a thing as perfect for NIST compliance. You just have to keep chipping away at it. There's things that we're not, you know, we're just finishing up now, like the dual-factor authentication, you know. I intentionally waited till the very last minute for that because it's expensive. You know, those RSA tokens and the smart cards, and then you gotta print them. So, you know, we're wrapping that up now. We waited till the end of the year. There's also some policies and procedures that, you know, we're not done with yet, and, you know, that's okay. We can mitigate the risk, we can actually speak to the risk, and we put in our plan that, yep, we're gonna fix these down the road, and we'll put a, you know, an action plan to that in milestones. So that's kind of our roadmap to it, and I can talk more in detail if you guys have questions, but you know, I think that's a good start.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so now it's time for some war stories. You know, as Dr. Ross said, as Chris just said, there's no perfect. In data security, it's much harder to be on the defense than to be on the offense. You know, the offense wins a lot of the time in getting into systems, most every time. And so it's all about early detection and being able to manage the crisis, manage those incidents as effectively as possible. So, you know, Brandon, it's your time. Talk about, you know, just kind of approach to incident management, and then maybe a couple war stories here or there would be great.
So, yeah, I guess I pose this question to everybody. So what keeps you guys awake at night? Because you know, there are different industries here, different companies, different size companies. So just shout it out. What's some of the things that keep you guys up?
Customer information being exfiltrated.
Okay. So, more of a cyber crime and more of an advanced adversary, that's quite a headache in and of itself. You're probably talking about lateral movement throughout your network, and then what vector are they using to get into your network? Are they hitting your employees with targeted email attacks? Is one of your employees using a computer to buy some DVDs and accidentally hits a Chinese website that's spoofed to look like a real website? And then it's called the drive-by attack, where the machine just downloads malware. How many people here are worried about ransomware? Anybody not know what ransomware is? Okay, so ransomware basically is malware that encrypts a computer, and then you get a splash screen that says, if you want your data back, pay this anomalous entity X amount of Bitcoins. People usually don't know what the hell a Bitcoin is. How do I get a Bitcoin? So, ransomware nowadays is pretty much a widespread headache in terms of, do you pay the ransom? Do you not pay the ransom? How do I protect myself? Anybody here heard of the WannaCry ransomware outbreak? Okay, so that happened a few months back. Does everybody here realize that that vulnerability that was exploited was actually patched by Microsoft weeks ahead of the ransomware campaign? How many people here don't have automatic updates installed on their network? How many people here don't know? I know, definitely some people lying here. So usually what I tell folks is...
People are getting real short arms.
Yeah, I know. In terms of incident response, guys, usually what I tell people is the simple things will prevent 85% of the headaches out there. So automatic patching on machines owned by your company, right? Just do it. Don't give an employee the option to turn an automatic update off. How many people, I know somebody's going to lie here, people have seen the Adobe Reader update screen that'll pop up. It's probably been popping up for years on your machine, and you always hit decline. So Adobe Reader is one of the most targeted pieces of software in the world. Advanced adversaries know this, that your company is most likely running some type of Acrobat reader, some PDF reader. It's most likely going to be Adobe. So that's what they target. And that's what those security updates being pushed to your machine actually are. They're preventing the future attacks from actually being successful. So for ransomware, like I said, automatic patching, automatic updates. In terms of the more advanced campaigns where you've got possibly a nation state, foreign nation state, they're interested in your intellectual property, right? So it might not be just customer data. It might be new research that your company is working on. It might be classified information or very sensitive unclassified information. How are you going to get hit with those? Most likely it's going to be waves of malicious emails where we call those social engineering attacks. I'm sure you guys have heard that 1,000 times already. But advanced attackers, if they're interested in your intellectual property enough, they're going to do their research. They're going to do their research on you. They're going to do their research on your employees. I know when I used to do this, we would spend sometimes dozens of hours just scouring websites looking for information on you. Your spouse's name, your girlfriend's name, your boyfriend's name, your children, what school your children go to, the names of their teachers. We'll scour your social media footprint, see who you're friends with. The Iranians, over the last couple of years, have leveraged social media to the point where there's estimated to be tens of thousands, or if not hundreds of thousands, of spoofed social networking profiles for high-ranking government, military, and defense contractor information out there. Drive-by, how many people know what a drive-by attack is? Okay, so a drive-by attack, an advanced adversary is going to do research on your company. They're going to know who your subcontractors are, who your suppliers are. They're going to basically put together a baseline of activity of what websites your company is hitting on a daily basis. So the next time you need to re-up some supplies or get some contract information out, the worst ones I've ever seen are signing up for a conference, right? So they're going to know what conferences your employees are going to attend. And what they're going to do is they're going to compromise the website for signing up for that conference. So basically your employees aren't going to be doing anything wrong. They're going to be signing up for a conference that they've been signing up for the last 3 years. And when they download that conference application is going to be weaponized. It's going to have malware on it. And it's going to drop on your machine, compromise the network, and then from there, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start moving laterally throughout your network. So it doesn't matter what machine I compromise. The only thing I care about is that a machine is compromised on your network. And once I can get on your network, I'm going to start moving laterally through your network until I get to the machine that has the information that I want. Then from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up the mess. I'm going to clean up all the other machines that I compromise. To get to that machine, I'm going to drop 3 or 4 more pieces of malware on that machine. So in case you find one piece of malware on that machine, you didn't catch the other 3 that I just dropped. And there I basically established a foothold on your network for days, months. Some of the worst I've seen have been for years. And these are companies on the island here. They've been compromised for years and just didn't even know it. Basically, they were just hemorrhaging PII, they were hemorrhaging intellectual property, and then I get a call when one of their schematics ends up on a bulletin board from a Chinese university in Shenyang. And they're like, how the heck did that happen? You know, we go back, do the forensic investigation, and basically find out that they've been compromised for years. So long story short, I don't want to give anybody a heart attack. Automatic updates, guys, you know, some of the things that Chris has been mentioning, 2-factor authentication, whole disk encryption, little things like that, just going through the baseline steps and not stressing yourself out too much, but just, you know, hitting the baseline things can basically thwart about 85% of these. The other 15%, there's nothing you can do. I'm not going to try to waste your time. It is what it is. So that's why having a strong incident response plan, having something in mind, having a plan in place when something will happen, because it will, that'll get you the other 15% of the way.
So can we, thank you very much. Can we look at maybe to the fear of customer information getting out of the walls of the establishment, maybe looking at it from a privacy and compliance standpoint, you know, incident response as it relates to, oh boy, I'm going to have to do something and notify people about it.
So if you look at, so just to follow up on Brendan said, if you think about it, this is, you know, with the advanced persistent threat, and the audience here today, we all are at the top of the food chain for who we're going after. So one of the things that needs to be looked at is a lot of times we start to look at the regs and we look at the requirements, and we start to parse down what is CDI or what do I have to protect. You really have to look at the whole system. And I counsel that all the time, is to say, look at this holistically. You know, they mark out that, well, one of the things that isn't is your HR and your financial data aren't part of it, because you don't have to worry about that. We don't consider that CDI under the, well, but do you want it out there? Don't you want to protect that? Just your HR data can have other implications for being out there. So really, you really need to take a holistic approach to the entire network, and I think it's almost a waste of time to parse it out. The example given where you can have a separate laptop, that's great if that fits your business, where you have such a small business that you can really put things just on one machine. But for the most part, the folks that are here need to look at that. Now, what happens, even like Brendan said, what happens that you've done all this 85% there, you can't protect yourself on the other 15%. Having an incident response plan to understand what you should do is paramount, number one. Secondly, having the backup capability that allows you to recover as part of that is number two, is to look at that whole, what do I do and how do I recover from that? And then where you have incidences where you have contractual liability to report a breach. Now, your contractual liability could be your insurance company requires you to, your customer requires you to, or the law requires you to. What are you prepared to do that? Do you know what information you have to respond to a breach? So part of this on here, I'm also a state rep from Rhode Island, and the Pell Center worked, and some of the people in this room worked on, with Lou DePalma and myself, Senator DePalma, in updating our data breach protection laws for Rhode Island. Well, there are 47 different standards around the country on if there's a data breach, what you have to tell people. And then what is a breach, and what are your responsibilities? The federal government still hasn't addressed that yet from a totality. So I've had clients where you have to go through, okay, what do you have? What states were your folks from, or where are you located? You know, is it where the data is housed, or where the people live? And who do you have to give notice to? So you have to set up this large rubric. The recent Uber, I'm not involved in the Uber breach.
Thank goodness.
But just in what I've read in the newspaper, I looked at our data breach law and said, well, I don't think under Rhode Island law, based on what I read in the newspaper, that they have a responsibility to disclose to me, who is an Uber customer, that that hasn't been compromised. but is it a good practice to? Is it a good business practice to just say, hey, we know this happened, we apologize, because this information's out there, and that information, as everyone knows, someone has that information, they couple it with other things, and suddenly they try to do some not nice stuff. So from an incident response perspective, it's very important for you to understand what data you have, what your responsibilities are legally and contractually, and then just from a business perspective, what's a good business practice to let people know that you care about the data integrity.
Can I, one part of the DFARS proclamation, which put in place the requirement for the NIST, the cyber clause, is that you need to notify them of any breach within 72 hours. And that's critical to know, because you may be asked that, and that's going to be one of those things that will be a touch point for them. If you are not even aware that you're supposed to be notifying them of an incident within 72 hours, red flags, they're going to start digging more. So just be aware that that's an important component that you need to notify if you're working with the Department of Defense or CIO, and if you're working with a prime contractor, they'll have usually a CIO that you need to report any cyber incident within 72 hours.
And I'm sure Brandon and Stephen can attest, that is almost impossible to be able to assess, oh boy, it was an incident. First of all, determining whether it was an incident or not. Secondly, how big, the scope, where is it, what data, et cetera. And third, getting all the people in the room to come up with a determining statement on what the incident was in totem, and because there's a lot of investigation often needed from a forensic standpoint.
Isn't there something in the DFARS that basically says you have to report it once you know it's been a breach?
Right.
So that kind of covers what you're saying. You have to know it's been a breach first before you have to report it, before that 72-hour process.
Right. And that's, from a legal standpoint, there's some gray area there, because most state laws will say as soon as practicable, notification must, or some have it be 30 or 45 days, depending on the state. So the 72 hours, even with the knowing, is still really tight.
So when we wrote the Rhode Island law, one of the things we did, Francesca, if you watch the video, you'll remember we did this. What we did was we said it's 45-day clock, and you have to give notice, and here's what's in the notice. And we tied to the knowing to be able to fill out the notice. So if you have 5 things that are required of the notice, once you can actually give people notice and tell them, and you can ascertain those things, because you may know something happened, but you don't know the extent. Because some of the laws say you need to notify everyone within 30 days of a breach, and you have to tell them these things. Well, I don't know them. How can I do that? I cannot ascertain that within the 30 days. In the 72 hours of what is a knowing breach is also, the other thing is you need a medium certificate. You need the authentication. So to log on to the automatic site to let the DoD know there was a breach, you need to first have a certificate that shows who you really are. Because I could go on tomorrow and say, well, is this Steve Ucci, I work at Right Solutions, and there was a breach. I could just go on, and so you need a, well, that's in the,
There's like a 2-week lead
well,
time.
then there's a lead time for it.
It's a medium assurance
Certificate
certificate token.
Yeah.
PCI token. That's a DFARS.
That's in the DFARS
You gotta-
too, yeah.
Yeah, you gotta go to dibnet.dod.mil.
Yeah, it's in the- Yeah, so you need to have that in place in order to go on and register the breach. So that's one of the things that needs to be part of your plan is who has that and do they have the ability to add the information?
So as an example of the leading edge statement I made earlier, in Europe, they have a law that goes into place in May of 2018 called GDPR. They also have 72-hour notification. That would be the first of its kind from a countrywide basis. Their penalty for noncompliance could be up to 6% of revenue, of annual revenue. So we're talking mega enforcement capability. So the question?
So how are outsourced service providers managed in terms of their, let's say their coverage, or do they have your information like an HR or a payroll company? And how is that data managed? Are you receiving reports, SOC reports if you're kind of a service organization provider? So let's say you've outsourced your HR department, and they have all of your personnel information. And how, in terms of your risk assessment, how are they brought in, and how are you getting assurance that that data is being held confidential?
Suzanne, you want to?
Well, first of all, you can't outsource compliance. So when you talk about service providers, I'm going to be very specific about one type of compliance, which is payment card industry. If you've hired a call center to get on the phone and start dialing for dollars, and they're collecting credit card numbers over the phone for you, PCI is extremely prescriptive in what you have to do. They don't give you general statements, but they're very prescriptive. Every one of those service providers has to have been assessed and has to have completed a SAQ, and it's assessed and it's attested to and signed off by. And if they don't do that, then you are responsible for going in and assessing them, all right? You also have to make sure your contracts have certain language that's inside of it. And at the end of the day, if that contractor that you allowed to have that information is breached, the onus comes on you from a PCI perspective. You have an agreement with Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover to protect the cardholder data. The fact that you gave it to this person to take care of because they said, don't worry, I'll take it on my website. They have a breach, you're the one that gets the fines and the fees from the PCI Council. You can go after them legally, but they don't have any agreement with them. And the same thing's true in the other types of compliances that are out there. Generally what goes on today in companies is that they have a vendor management program oversight. And that's a huge piece because you cannot trust your vendor to protect the data. You're outsourcing because you don't feel you can handle it and do a good job. Well, you want to make sure you give it to somebody who can handle it and who can do a good job. And I always say, I'm not a lawyer, but I always say, when you hire a company that puts you at risk, make sure their pockets are deeper than yours, because you're going to have to sue them.
And that the contracts spell out, what happens in the scenario you just laid out. Who does what? How is that incident responded to? Again, you're the custodian of that data, whether it's your subcontractor or you that's housing it at the time of incident. But you can, save a lot of headache by planning ahead in how you want that contractor to work with you.
And it can be an excellent risk mitigation. So 4 years ago, when people say, what do you think of the cloud? I'd say, well, I don't know. I don't know where the stuff is. As you mature, even today they said using cloud technology to manage this may be the right path for a lot of you in order to mitigate your risk here. But it goes down to what's in that contract. So you always have the risk. How much are you offloading that risk on that person? Do they have the financial wherewithal? Do you have the right to audit? What has their experience been? It really comes down to how you manage what's in that contract and how you manage that vendor.
Is there a question back there? Yeah. If you could speak up a little bit, I'm sorry.
So Ron talked a little bit about mapping ISO 27000 to CUI requirements in 80171. At the very end of that, he said, hopefully you can get that through to your contracting officer or something like that. And I've heard of stories where contracting officers are kind of talking about stricter requirements than 80171 and the workbook and the POAM have. Do you have any guidance for kind of the smaller companies when the contracting officer is kind of pushing heavier requirements? Do they kind of win because they're the customer, so to speak? Or did any of you have any guidance in those situations?
When you talk about being a subcontractor, somebody owns that contract. And the person who owns that contract, then they're the ones that have to answer to everyone else. And they have to make sure you don't put them at risk. So if the requirement makes a statement that you need to have access controls in place, all right, and your contractor says, I need to see a document that it's signed off that shows that you printed up all your access control lists from your software, and you went through it and you reviewed it, that there's no one that's generic, there's no one that's this, and that you've signed off that you reviewed that on a quarterly basis, and I want to see those last 3 quarterly reports. Yes, that's a part of auditing, and if that's what they want for you to keep that job, then you're going to have to do it. If they're asking you to do something that you don't believe is right, now that's just a disagreement you have with them. But when you look at being compliant with something, then it has to come from the regulations, requirements, and controls. Those are all the same words. So it has to come from there, And then, but there's minutia, there's substantive testing, and that's what they're doing for you, is doing the substantive testing on that.
Can I answer your question?
It's all
But
about risk.
I have to have one thing on. So in this world, what I would say is if a prime comes and says that, you say, what is my charge number for the contract for me to sit and
Trust but
show
verify.
you all of my logs? So I'll push back a little on this. I would caution you to, your requirement is to self-certify, and the DOD's come out and said, well, we aren't going to require, we trust you that when you sign up to that contract, you're attesting to compliance. I think that the stick will be on the back end if there's a breach. So to your point of a service provider, so you hire up a service provider and you say, you're going to do this, this, and this for me, and I'm going to be on you, then I would absolutely agree that you stay on them. In the DOD contracting world where you're required to deliver a subsystem and you're signing up to this and you're working this, I would caution to push back on the primes who may have a tendency to overreach and want to get into the nitty-gritty because they've assigned a team that just does this. And the magic word is always, great, what do I charge on the contract? Because then that team will go back and say, what do I charge? And they'll say, leave them alone. So, now, one little piece about it I have to add in. What I've noted, and I haven't seen it yet, but I think there will be instances where, depending on the type of contract and what's being done, that it's going to be part of your requirements that you have a certain level of security in place because of what you're handling or what you're doing. And that's going to be called out, and what they suggest is it'll even be in a special H clause in the contract, that it's going to talk more about cybersecurity and having to demonstrate that as maybe award criteria as far as a procurement. As that goes along and that becomes really embedded in the nitty-gritty of a particular contract, I think then your requirements to respond and show things that, like almost as you would quality for any other, will be there. But for right now, for the run-up to December 31st, if you're getting that pushback, my thing would be ask for a charge number.
These guys had a question first. Did you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry.
Just to follow up on that interesting discussion about subcontractors is maybe Chris or Mike, you get a contract that has a clause in it, right? And now you, in some cases, you try to flow that down to your supply chain, including some commercial entities. And you've signed up for this. What are you doing as far as compliance for that? Could be 5 vendors, it could be 2,000 vendors that you go.
Yeah, so luckily, since I am on the IT side of the house, and this is an initiative that's company-wide, that's actually handled through contracts. So I don't handle the flow down of the clause. I am the recipient of the flow down from the primes, and don't be surprised if you do get calls from primes, because we've gotten calls already from some large primes where you have to sit down and you have to justify every single requirement that you said you complied with for a multi-hour, review. But yeah, in terms of the actual flow down, so the DFARS says you have to flow it down to your subs. I don't handle that. That goes to the contracting program in our company, and they handle the flow down.
So suppose, like, Ron gave the example of the 2 scientists, right? So they're subs to you.
Yeah. Are you saying what's the onus on us making sure that they're compliant? Right now, the DFARS doesn't spell out that we have to audit. It says that we have to flow down the requirement. So,
They give you their security plan.
what do you say?
Well, that's what, in the banking world, we've had to do that for years, and that's what we would ask for, is we would ask, depending on the risks that they pose, on the size of the contract, what kind of information they had. We had a whole risk assessment, and we would definitely ask for a right to audit. We would ask for all their information security plans, and it would be part of our contract. And again, you have to kind of take it at a risk-based approach to it. It's surprising that this is new in this area, because really, you're often, your subs are handling critical information, whether it's CUI, CDI, or even your own company, corporate protective, sensitive information.
Yeah,
But
some primes are asking the subs to either get an audit or give them another one's aren't, right?
Right.
So, I'm just wondering if there's some consensus among the group about what the primes are doing as far as their supply chain.
it sounds like there's some interpretation, right? And my guess is maybe in the audit process, they're going to start to get some clarity on.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
this is just now coming out in your industry, even though it's been here for quite some time in other industries. And so you have best practices, what's come up, and you also have all these different frameworks that you talk about, whether it's the ISO framework or the PCI framework or the HIPAA. They're basically all the same, and the controls are all the same. They just say them differently. Some are not as detailed as the others. But at the end of the day, what you're looking at in every single one of those is consistent, and that's out there. So after this December, you're going to see more stuff coming out because they're going to follow the standard operating procedures for audits. This is not a one-time deal. More than likely, you're going to be like all the other compliances that you have to assess on an annual basis. So don't look at this as an event, thank goodness it's done. No, this is an ongoing process. So they're probably going to tell you every year you have to reassess and you have to resubmit. That's a standard operating procedure in compliance world.
Suzanne, you're one step ahead of me. That's where I wanted to go is okay, now we're live. You know, it's 6 months from now, it's 10 months from now. What's changed in all of your lives? What's different? You know, what's still unknown?
We always run like a security improvement program or a security improvement plan annually. I think just the scope of that plan has now changed. And we actually now have a more, I guess, granular approach because we actually see the 110 requirements we have to hit. Whereas before it was kind of a shot in the dark because as a DoD subcontractor, or contractor in general, we're not like the healthcare industry or the PCI industry. It's just we're playing catch up. So they've been doing this for years. Now we actually have every year when we're looking at our POAM or our gap analysis, we can actually have requirements to point to in terms of what needs to be improved.
There's a question.
And I think
I'm sorry.
policies, documentation is going to be critical because you're going to be asked, as your contract's renewed or new, you're going to be asked for evidence. And the system security plan is a good start, but they may ask you for access policy or a risk assessment or a vendor management policy. And that documentation, while it's not really going to, it's kind of a CYA thing, it's going to be their way to prove to their people that you guys know what you're doing, have the proper programs in place. So, and that's where I think we get through over this hump. Yeah, okay, we've got a plan. You have to work that plan, make sure you're moving forward on it, and then you've got to have the evidence behind that.
And I want to just add a little extra piece to that. And from a lawyer perspective, you're right in there. When we talk about evidence, we're really talking about you need to have some type of an artifact. And you understand when I say this, that whatever you present that shows that you're doing this, if you look at that, if a lawyer takes you to court and the judge says, wait a minute, there's no name on this, there's no date when it was done, there's no way for me to know you didn't write this the last 5 minutes, that you actually had it in place at the time of the breach. Please make sure that everything that you provide as, quote, evidence can truly be evidentiary in a court of law if you have to go there. So if you start out by defining how you're going to capture these artifacts and what they're going to look like, then every year you do the same thing over and over and over again, and it reduces your risk of heavy fines and fees if there is a breach and then you have to go to court.
Yeah, and that was actually part of our policy review, was we had policies that were written when I joined the company, and we had to do a review of whether or not they would hold up in court. If an employee took us to court, because now we have a new policy that's mapping to a requirement, whether or not you even stand up. So we had to do the review, like she was just saying, putting dates, signatures, review dates, and then making sure that all the language in the policies are uniform across policies and they're not conflicting, and to make sure that they actually hold up in a court of law.
Yeah, my firm's handled over 4,500 breach incidents for businesses and work with regulators from all different places, and it's not your answer. It's just like grade school. Show your math. It's how you got there. It's how you document it. That's what they want to see, is how thoughtful were you in the process, and did you document it in real time? And was it, a solid business practice and not just a whim? And they really want to see your thought processes.
So I could actually ask you all questions on Down to what GPO.
Sounds like you're having trouble with your buyer or the contracting context.
I guess one of my biggest misconceptions, I guess, is I thought CUI was something that their contracting officer would package and label and send to us. But I hear you talk about, oh, do we have it already? So is it the kind of thing we could have accidentally created and not even known, and then it's the burden on us to go through and identify it?
That's a great question.
Yes. There's a big or. So it says all the things we label as CDI, you have to protect. And then there's an or. And I wrote it down. Anything collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by or on behalf of the contractor for the contract. So, yes, it's, yeah, like, oh, it's only the stuff we mark unless we didn't mark it and you've touched it and now it's all, yeah, it's kind of tricky.
And data comes in 3 forms: paper, electronic, and voice.
That's a good point. Was there another question?
Question for Steve. We've heard from a lot of people that having a system security plan is important. You know, it outlines where you stand today or at the end of the year and POA going forward. Would you suggest, assuming we have that now, a company has that, would you suggest that you offer that to your ACO at that time, or do you wait until you're asked?
I don't think they're going to ask for it. I don't think I don't think they will ask you for it. I don't think they.
I agree, but do you think it's something that we need to offer?
I don't think it's any.
I
I don't. So. I don't think they're going to. The lack of offering it. I don't think there's anything to. Let me back up. I don't think there's any harm in sharing that with them because clearly you've done it. I don't think anyone in this room is going to have a problem. I think the problem is going to happen with the person who, I want more orders in, and they don't know what they're signing up to. That's the person who's going to get hit with a default or a False Claims Act. That's how they're going to hit you on the False Claims Act, because you're signing up, swear to you that this is what we're doing and we're compliant. It's always on the fraud angle that you lied. So I think they're not going to, this isn't going to be a granular audit of these things. It's going to be, there's a breach. What did you do? Was it reasonable? What are all your ducks in a row? Did you make a reasonable attempt at doing this depending on the sophistication of your business? To go in and so that's one piece. It doesn't hurt to be transparent. It never hurts to be transparent. And you all know this in the business. The more customer intimacy you have on every level of what you do, the easier it is that they will appreciate the fact that you know what you're doing. That goes to your quality standards, your manufacturing plans. I mean, I've always said, do I have to give up my manufacturing plans? So do you want to show them what you're doing? Do you want to have a higher degree of fidelity of what you're doing? It's always a trade-off. So as the lawyer, I say, only give them what you're paid to give them. If they give you if they pay you, if they give you a task instruction to deliver this thing, you deliver it to them and they pay for it. But it doesn't hurt to be transparent on that if you're doing this in good faith.
Was there another question?
So aside from just identifying the CUI, this might be more geared towards Mike and Chris. Aside from identifying what CUI you currently have and what you currently deal with, did you also sort of map the flow of CUI through the company, and what did you do after figuring out, where it goes, how it comes in, what it touches, how it leaves? Were the subsequent policies you created to make sure it doesn't go outside those bounds?
Yeah, so you have to do that, right? You have to identify where it is, and there's a few requirements that directly relate to flow. Because like Ross was talking about earlier, you have to make sure that at rest, while it's being processed on any given number of machines or in transit, that it meets all the requirements all the way through. So doing an analysis of your network and your architecture is along with the identification of CUI. And then that might stem, network changes or segmentation changes. I agree with everyone on the panel that stated that putting it on one laptop is definitely not, there's no way you're going to be able to do that because, like we just said, you can generate it like that. I can open up a Word document and write something on behalf of the contract that just came out of my mind, but now it's CUI. It's directly tied to the work I'm doing. And you got to be more blanket than you are restrictive. And then the policies that came out of it were every policy you can imagine. I would probably go to the SANS Institute, look at all the policies they have, see whether or not you have it, and whether or not it would be beneficial to add it to the company. But everything is going to have to be documented. You can't satisfy a requirement without having an artifact to back it up, and that's normally going to be documentation. Even if it's a technical implementation, you still need procedures and policies on how that's supposed to function, who's supposed to function it, how it's audited, so that when you do get audited, you can refer to those artifacts.
One thing I've done too is if your company's big enough to support it, we put like a data manager in place, someone who is the frontline person who's receiving that data from the contracts. So we kind of made them responsible to, hey, when this comes from this customer, evaluate if it's CUI, mark it appropriately, and then store it appropriately. And then from there, like our policies and procedures define the flow, and that, you know, that person follows that same flow we defined. And that it took a lot of a burden off some of the more technical people and put it on the people who are actually generating and dealing with that CUI daily.
Yeah, and not everything's going to be a technical implementation because you'll go bankrupt. You can't put 1,000 pieces of machine and software in your environment to keep everyone safe. It has to be involving end users. They have to be aware of what their responsibility is as the end user, right? And then follow your flow of roles with your data owners and your managers, IT managers, and make sure that they understand what their role is in terms of flow. Because a small business with 2 people, they can't have, well, 2 might be easier because it's only 2 people, maybe 50. Controlling the flow with type of technical mechanism is way harder and more expensive than letting everyone know how CUI is supposed to flow in the environment, or it's only supposed to be stored here. Then you obviously have ways to determine if it's not, but not restricting them solely with that only method using software. It'll be very expensive.
So maybe, Chris, now you've flagged all your CUI coming in the door. How are you monitoring to make sure it's protected? How
Again,
any
that's
best
where
practices?
what we found is, like, just like what Mike said, it's very hard to deal with it on a technological level. You deal with it in a policy level and make people accountable and responsible for it. So you're not out of compliance. Another thing, you know, on the technology side, we do have like specific locations where the CUI is stored. It's our whole file server, actually. We treat it. But we have tools in place where we can see who touched what file when. It doesn't matter if it's CUI or not CUI, but if we did ever have an incident, we can hand that auditing and accountability data to the right people and say, hey, we had a breach, or this CUI went where it wasn't supposed to, but here's the path, it's in the logs, it's recorded, and it, you know. So it's one way of kind of dealing with that and working around it. Because it's never going to be perfect, something I've learned. You have to just put what you can in place and then make people responsible.
All right, let's hang out with Stephen in the muck for a bit. It's near Cranston, right? The worst case scenario. Tell me, I'd love to hear from each of the panelists, what would you view your nightmare scenario, your worst case scenario? And Brandon, since you deal with this often, we'll start with you.
Worst case scenario?
We're live. NIST is you know, the regs are live and in action.
Worst case scenario, I think, you know, I've been hearing a lot of good thoughts here, but, you know, in terms of an advanced adversary, you know, one of the primary TTPs or tactics, techniques, procedures of an adversary is basically to wipe up their own mess, right? So they're going to wipe logs, they're going to attack firewalls, attack security measures to basically give themselves a persistent presence on your network and basically give themselves administrative rights. So what I would say is, you know, don't just rely on technology, don't just rely on a piece of paper going through, you know, and thinking you've done it once, that's it, that's all you need to worry about. You know, this is something it's just like security, you know, it's just like war games, the movie War Games. You know, nothing is ever done, nothing is ever perfect, nothing is ever secure. There's no such thing as a secure system. So, you know, just not relying, not just doing this once and then relying on a third party. You know, you kind of have to live this life. You kind of have to live security from now on. It doesn't matter what you do with the company. I think it was Chris or Mike that said, getting the end users, getting all of your employees involved in this, the weakest link in the chain is your employee behind the keyboard. And it doesn't matter if they work in security, it doesn't matter if they work in HR, it doesn't matter if they're, cutting the grass. If they have access to your network, they could be the person that brings down everything. And then from there, once a persistent adversary gets in your network and gives themselves administrator rights, they can pretty much do anything. They can disable patching, they can disable antivirus, they could basically stomp on your logs, so just.
Nancy, do you have a worst-case scenario, your nightmare scenario?
It's hard to put it into words as far as worst case, but I had one client that, by going through this assessment, they're a small shop, provide a tool that's part of the aircraft industry, and nice guys, have a great relationship with their prime vendors, and their antivirus hadn't been running since 2013. And while we were trying to patch it and run it, constantly getting hit with intrusions. So they were under attack. And these are nice guys, they're located on the island, and been supplying the, meeting all their contract requirements. We've scrubbed it, we've locked it down as best we can, but, hearing what Brandon's saying, who knows what and how long it's been going on, if they haven't been updating since 2013, 2014. So, I don't know if that's a worst case, but that's a very likely case for a lot of small contractors, so.
The subcontractors, guys, most of the people in this room, I worked for Raytheon for years. And we would set up ops all the time where, as soon as Raytheon would push something out in the press that, hey, Raytheon just won this contract, here are the subs, those subs were getting hit instantly. You just, because you become a sub on a large contract, you just put a bullseye on yourself. And the breaches that we see, just like Nancy was saying, it's called lateral movement, right? So once an adversary discovers that you pulled one of their compromised machines off your network, it's like whack-a-mole. Right, we would go literally hand-to-hand combat in real time with adversaries across on the other side of the globe, where we would pull a machine and we'd see another machine pop up on the network, start communicating instantly. And it was going back and forth with the adversary in real time. We would pull a machine, they would fire it on the machine live. So that's kind of especially if you guys are working in defense and you're a sub for a large defense contractor, if you're not getting hit, you're already compromised. And let's leave it at that.
Yeah. Mike?
Besides the nightmare scenarios that keep me up about the malware and malicious attacks, I think a nightmare scenario is not balancing these requirements out with making your business remain productive and efficient, and losing the way your business does business, so you're not as competitive in the workplace. Because I think you could easily go overboard and misread the requirements, or drive away the people that wanted to join the corporation because you stood for something. So it's just making sure that you are aware of the changes you're making in the organization as a whole, to make sure your organization is still remaining profitable, and that good people still want to join the organization. And they're not coming into a fascist state, and then everything else that, I guess, making sure that your backups are good, and having a backup strategy, and testing backups, because obviously a dormant threat, one of the first things I would do is get into the backup system and make sure that I'm getting off the tape as a threat, so that if they do try and recreate the environment, I'm in there already. And depending on your rotation policy, if it's a year and a half, as soon as that dormant threat lives there for 2 years, everything is infected, all your backups and the current systems. That's probably my biggest fear, is that, I go to a backup tape from 2 years ago and it's infected with the same malware that I'm infected with now. So making sure that you commonly, you take them out, you test them. If it's a 0 day, I mean, that's one thing. It's making sure your packets are encrypted and hardened off-site. Yeah, probably speaking.
No, that's a big thing. I mean, one of the first things that ransomware looks for is connected backups. So once it pops a machine, it's a worm. Most ransomware is worm, so it's going to start worming your way through a network. And aside from looking for specific file types, the next thing that it's going to look for is any connected machines, and that includes connected backups. So, for folks in here that have a small business, I know it's a pain in the butt sometimes, but doing that backup and then air gapping it, disconnecting it from the network, disconnecting it from machines, and putting it somewhere else could save you a lot of ransom money later on.
Chris, you have anything to add?
My biggest fear, I think, is more on the insider threat level. They're already inside your network. They're granted permissions to certain things. It's a lot easier for them to do something really bad. Even on a social engineering aspect, they could befriend somebody who has access to more sensitive data. It's not something you can really fix with a piece of paper, with a policy. So that's my biggest one. That's the one that keeps me up at night the most.
Suzanne?
Today, the two biggest risks that you have are your vendors and they're your employees. Everything else comes because of their, I'm going to say negligence, even though they don't believe that. An example of what we are seeing in the world out there, and let me give you a financial example, is that we have a client who is a financial advisor. And we've seen this happen multiple times, that a person is called and told that they are the boss and that I need $100,000 from John Smith's account transferred to this other account. And the people have been trained. The people have been told not to do that. And you wonder, how could they be so stupid to do that? Because they haven't been trained where they can bring what they've been trained back to the workplace. It's real easy for me to tell you a policy. It's real easy for me to tell you, don't allow a transfer unless it comes from Steve. Don't do that.
Or to Steve. You can always transfer to me.
Okay. So how do they do that? Because, like was said before, they know that the boss is speaking at a lecture because he put it on LinkedIn. They know what hotel he's staying in because that's all out there. They know everything about him. They do a lot of research ahead of time. And they know everything about Sally Jane, who is taking the call. They know her kids and everything else. One classic example is the person called up and said they were the boss. And I'm here at this conference and whatnot. I can't do this transfer. I need you to do it. Well, sir, we need to do so and so. Language got really bad. And then she said, I can't do it. We have a policy button. And he said, I told you to do it. And he hangs up and he calls back. And then he tells her what he's going to do to his daughter if this doesn't happen and you get this done tomorrow. And the transfer happens. All right? None of that was real, but these people out there are so bad and they're so good at taking everything that they find. When you hear, don't worry, there was a huge breach, but nothing was done with that data, oh yeah, it was. It's being aggregated, fuzzy logic to make up stuff about you. My point is, in your organization, when you train your people, don't use a checkbox training. Go through live scenarios of what would happen in their case. Harvard does a great job of case studies. Give them something like that. Make them think through the scenario of what they would do. Your weakest link is your unskilled, untrained employee. And the more you can help them to understand how bad and how evil those people are out there, that they can take what you're telling them to their home. Because remember, Ring is attached to your internet, and anybody can get anything now out of your house once you attach that new doorbell to your house and the videos. Bottom line, train them well, train them to be able to do logical thinking and to make some quality decisions and not to just check a box that they read a policy.
So, I pretty much had to tell with my nightmare scenario, it's that, the people who aren't in this room, the empty seats, because these are the folks who aren't doing this. That's who's really going to get nailed. From my client perspective, I'm worried about the clients who aren't paying enough attention to this or pay a lip service, suddenly something happens and then they're made an example of. So that's one scenario. And another hat, personally, is I've been lucky enough to be named the CISO of my law firm. So
I'm so sorry.
who's our, I get that, who's our CISO? I'm like, you? They're like, no, it's you now. So I sat with my technology folks and I walked in and we're going to implement this SP from NIST. It's just, it's a wonderful, if you take away the fact that you have to do it and you just go through it, it's a really nice way to understand what you need to do from a best practices scenario. So the more we train people to understand that this protects your business, this is a good business practice to have in place regardless of industry, I think the better off we'll be. So it's clearly, it's a risk on all of us at home, at work, everything, that these simple things that we talk about all the time that we just don't do. I went out and bought Amazon Echo to see what it was like. I plugged it in, I made it, my daughter and I had a ball with it. And then one morning I got up and I'm like, I unplugged it. And now I don't want that thing in my house. It's just a natural curiosity. And to steal from my friend Mike Toscano, who says, we are technology immigrants. We're new to all this. It's not natural to us. We don't understand it. We're used to things that you buy things, it's a good product, you buy this thing to last and it's good. And the idea that you're constantly sending these updates and patches, and I don't want to learn something new, I don't want to be bothered, I don't want to press this button. My daughter's 10, she's a technology native. She gets it. It's easy for her. Thankfully, the new generation coming up is so used to all of this and how to figure this out. It's much easier for them to be part of this and part of the solution. So it's almost everyone's on the panel. Embrace your entire organization from a training perspective, from a knowledge perspective. Bring in those folks who are really good in technology and get their input on things and learn from them. So that's mine.
Any questions of the crowd?
Yeah, just a follow-up. We started with NIST, the 110 controls, and checking those off and having corrective action plans and handing them off to potential contracting officers if necessary or partners. But I would imagine that information itself is critical, controlled, sensitive information that shouldn't be distributed as well.
Point.
Correct. That's your security plan is always part of your critical information. It's always part of that. That's always part of the most secure thing is how you secure things. So that's all part of that.
What I tell my clients is that we'll do the assessment and it contains the controls. What's the control activity? It explains everything that you're doing. Think about that. And then all those other stuff, I tell them, that's for you. We'll give you a management letter stating that we've done this and this and this and this and we've attested to it. But I would not give that out to anyone because the information on that is extremely sensitive unless you redact it. And who's going to pay for you to redact it? Yeah, so unless you have a subpoena, no.
I just hadn't heard that mentioned from the panel or anybody today, that in itself is critical information.
You are giving the ingredients of how you're protecting your network. Why would you want to give that out?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Maybe just one closing comment from each of the panelists, and then any remaining questions. So we'll start off with you, Nancy.
It's hard to judge where people are here. As you said, the people that aren't in the room are probably presenting the biggest risks. But hopefully we've been able to sift down what is critical for the next 25 days, including holidays and weekends. Just get something down, go through the questions. Some are technical. You probably need somebody who understands. You definitely need somebody who understands the IT world. We've got this workshop going on afterwards. There's great resources I know that will be provided. I'm sure there'll be information going out. Just get something down. Then the hard work really comes into place, so is putting it into action. So.
Great. Mike?
I would say, the first step is, admitting you have a problem. So if you guys don't, if you haven't looked at it yet, then pick up a copy and start reading it. If you guys have looked at it, but you have the ostrich approach and you had your head in the sand, make sure that you guys take it a little bit more seriously. Go through some of the steps that we talked about today and trying to get that risk assessment started and your system security plan drafted. And then definitely highlight the requirements that you need to meet past December 31st, and notify your contracting officer and 1,000 other things. So,
Brandon?
best of luck.
Thanks, Mike.
After the implementation, really put together a plan, but then really, every once in a while, tabletop your plan. So even if you don't have the technical people in the room, just go through a scenario a month. It can be a half an hour, but some common things that I've dealt with in the past. You'll have a company that knows somebody got into their network, and then they saw an encrypted file being exfiltrated out of their network, and that was it. And the company doesn't know what data was stolen, right? They just saw an encrypted blob leave their network. So does that define a breach? Is that a breach? You have to notify anybody. When you don't know what was taken, you knew something was taken. But, companies spend days, weeks, months contemplating, what do we do? Was this really a breach? And then, some companies just bury their head in the sand, other companies actually do something about it. So just running tabletop scenarios, like, for situations like that will honestly go a long way.
Thanks, Brandon.
So I would say don't just focus on those paper items, the SSP, the POAM. They're important, but it's just as important too to have your technological controls in place as best you can. You want to have your auditing and accountability. You want to have your dual factor. You want to get those big things out of the way. And those are also, if you can demonstrate that, auditors love that stuff. Even not just, that's a good demonstration that you're proactive and you're conscious about what you're working on, not just checking a box with a policy.
Thanks. Suzanne?
Well, this is the first part of a journey that's going to go on probably for the lifetime of your organization. And the first year is always the toughest. It's like building a house. It takes you forever to get it built, but once it's built, then you have to maintain it. Realize that security is a process. It's not an event, and throughout the year, you need to sustain what you are doing. And when you look at those controls, you can look at some of them and say, oh my goodness, we should be doing this on a weekly basis or whatnot. You determine the time frame of when you're going to sustain this program throughout. But realize you're on the very beginning of it, and it's going to go on and on and on as long as we have the technological advances that we have in the world today. Good luck.
So do the technical people in the room have patience with us who aren't techies and tell us why? Because if you tell us the why, there's like some exponential improvement in people following what you ask. And to those of us in the room, hug your IT professionals who are trying to get this done and give them a break and stop getting, why is this? Why are you rebooting my computer? Give them a break and respect what's being done, because it's the people. Everyone said it's the people piece. It's up to us to be vigilant. When you do your training, don't have that, I'm going to test people, and if they get it wrong, they're going to get a hammer. That doesn't work. Teach them the why. Have training where you explain it to people. People want to protect the company. They want to do the right thing. No one wants to press the wrong button. You want people to raise their hand, so we all need to be nice.
Awesome. Any last questions, thoughts?
Do any of you have any recommendations or preference for computer operating system and the browser?
I don't know what that means.
Just make sure you configure it correctly. Don't just load it because it came in the mail like that. You need to turn off things that shouldn't be turned on. So,
well, you heard from Dr. Ross earlier, be a little concerned about your Samsung mobile device. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I would just make sure that your operating system is an end of life. Make sure that you harden it properly. And make sure that you understand some of the privacy concerns of newer operating systems that aren't dated. It's really hard to give a recommendation though across the board. Each company is unique. Some are totally Windows-based, some are hybrids. Some don't even use standard Mac or Windows operating systems. So just make sure you follow the necessary requirements to you should be good.
Any other questions? Well, thank you for being so participatory, for asking questions all the way through. I think that got a lot more out of this great panel, but if you can join me in giving a hand for these folks.